The story of one of history's most extraordinary figures begins not in the grand salons of Paris or the polished corridors of Versailles, but on the rugged, sun-drenched island of Corsica. Napoleon Bonaparte was born in the town of Ajaccio on August 15, 1769, just months after the island was transferred from the Republic of Genoa to the Kingdom of France. This accident of geography meant that Napoleon entered the world as a French subject, yet his heritage, culture, and early identity were deeply rooted in the rugged traditions of the Mediterranean. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was an ambitious lawyer who traced his lineage to minor Tuscan nobility. Sensing the shifting political winds under French rule, Carlo sought to secure official recognition of his family's noble status from the new administration. This modest aristocratic recognition was crucial, as it unlocked doors that would have otherwise remained firmly bolted shut, granting the young Napoleon access to educational opportunities on the French mainland that were reserved for the sons of nobles. Alongside Carlo stood Napoleon's mother, Letizia Ramolino, a woman of remarkable strength, resilience, and discipline. Letizia managed a bustling household of numerous surviving children amidst straitened financial circumstances, instilling in her children an enduring work ethic and a fierce sense of mutual loyalty. Growing up against a backdrop of rocky coastlines and rugged mountains, Napoleon developed an early independence of spirit. He spent his childhood exploring the wild landscapes of his native island, absorbing the turbulent local politics and the romantic ideals of freedom and resistance championed by Corsican leaders like Pasquale Paoli. However, the realities of his family's financial standing meant that ambition had to be paired with practical preparation. Carlo understood that if his sons were to rise above their provincial limitations, they needed to be sent away to be educated in France, where they could master the language, build connections, and learn the skills required to navigate the wider world. Thus, in the winter of 1778, 9-year-old Napoleon, accompanied by his older brother Joseph, left the familiar shores of Corsica for the very first time. The journey brought the young boy first to the religious college of Autun in Burgundy, where he was sent to rapidly learn the French language. Napoleon applied himself with intense focus, soon gaining enough command of French to transition to the next and more demanding phase of his education. In May 1779, he entered the military school at Brienne-le-Chateau in northeastern France, an institution designed to prepare young noblemen for careers in the royal army. Brienne proved to be a crucible that would permanently shape Napoleon's character, temperament, and worldview. Far from home, surrounded by strangers, and facing the stark austerity of a monastic school environment, the young Corsican experienced a profound sense of isolation. He spoke French with a heavy, distinct provincial accent, lacked the lavish wealth of his aristocratic classmates, and possessed an intense, brooding disposition that set him apart from the other boys. Taunted and mocked by wealthier peers who viewed him as an impoverished outsider, Napoleon withdrew inward, finding solace not in the social camaraderie of the courtyard, but in the silent companionship of books. He became a voracious and passionate reader, devouring histories, geographies, and classical literature. He found particular inspiration in the ancient biographies of Plutarch, losing himself in the grand deeds of Greek and Roman heroes, statesmen, and commanders. Within the structured confines of the school library, Napoleon built a vast mental landscape where tactical strategy, political philosophy, and historical ambition intertwined. While he struggled initially with subjects like German and literature due to his linguistic barriers, he demonstrated an extraordinary natural aptitude for mathematics. To the young Napoleon, numbers and geometry were not merely academic exercises. They were the fundamental laws governing trajectory, distance, force, and order. This profound mathematical competence naturally drew his gaze toward the technical branches of the military, particularly the artillery, where precision, calculation, and scientific planning dictated success on the battlefield. His teachers noted his exceptional focus, describing him in reports as reserved, hard-working, taciturn, and possessed of an overwhelming ego and an unyielding will. Napoleon was not merely studying to pass examinations. He was quietly preparing himself for a destiny far beyond the expectations of his birth. The transition from a lonely, misunderstood schoolboy to a determined young man took another sharp turn in February 1785, when his father, Carlo, died of stomach cancer in Montpellier. The loss of his father plunged the Bonaparte family into a precarious financial crisis. Suddenly, at the age of 15, though not the eldest son, Napoleon felt the acute pressure of familial responsibility. Rather than collapsing under the weight of grief and economic uncertainty, he accelerated his studies. Determined to relieve his family of the financial burden of his education and to enter active service as quickly as possible, he completed the standard 2-year course at the prestigious École Militaire in Paris in just a single year. Working with relentless intensity, he passed his final examinations in September 1785, earning a commission as a second lieutenant in the prestigious Lafayette Artillery Regiment. When Napoleon stepped out of the academy and into the wider world wearing the uniform of a Royal Artillery officer, the boy from Corsica had ceased to exist. Years of discipline, alienation, intensive study, and emotional hardening had forged a disciplined officer equipped with a sharp intellect, an unshakable sense of purpose, and an acute awareness of his own capabilities. He had mastered the foundational tools of his profession and nurtured an inner fire that would soon seek a grander stage upon which to burn. As the old Royal Order of France creaked toward its revolutionary collapse, this young, unknown officer stood ready at the threshold of history, carrying within him the fierce ambition, analytical mind, and relentless determination that would soon reshape the destiny of France and all of Europe. The crisp blue coat of the Lafayette Artillery Regiment carried with it a heavy weight of responsibility, but very little financial comfort. Second Lieutenant Napoleon Bonaparte joined his regiment at Valence in the autumn of 1785, stepping into a world that was rigid, traditional, and deeply stratified. The French Royal Army of the late 18th century was an institution designed primarily for the high nobility. Officers who lacked ancient lineages or deep pockets found themselves trapped at the lowest rungs of the military ladder, denied meaningful advancement regardless of their talent or dedication. For a young man from a minor Corsican family with empty pockets and a foreign accent, the path forward appeared blocked by ancient walls of privilege. Yet Napoleon was not one to accept limitation quietly. Instead of sinking into despair, he channeled his boundless energy into mastering the intricate science of his profession. Artillery was widely considered the intellectual branch of the army, while the infantry and cavalry relied heavily on physical bravery and aristocratic dash. The artillery required a deep understanding of mathematics, physics, geometry, and metallurgy. Cannon design, powder composition, trajectory calculation, and the logistics of moving heavy bronze pieces across difficult terrain demanded a sharp, analytical mind. Napoleon threw himself into these technical studies with a fierce intensity that astonished his peers. In his sparsely furnished quarters, surrounded by military manuals, charts, and mathematical treatises, he studied the works of great military theorists like Jean-Baptiste de Gribeauval, the visionary reformer who had modernized the French artillery system. Napoleon did not merely memorize formulas. He analyzed them, visualized them, and connected them to the realities of the battlefield. He walked through foundries, inspected gunpowder factories, and learned the exact weight, range, and operational limits of every cannon in the royal inventory. This deep technical competence gave him a quiet confidence that set him apart from his fellow officers, many of whom treated their military commissions as a casual social obligation rather than a serious vocation. Away from his books and drills, Napoleon faced the lonely reality of garrison life. His pay as a second lieutenant was meager, barely enough to cover his basic lodging and simple meals. He could not afford the luxurious lifestyle, fine dining, or social entertainment enjoyed by his wealthy aristocratic colleagues. As a result, he spent much of his free time alone, wandering the quiet streets of Valence or retreating into the local library, where he devoured history, philosophy, and political tracts by Enlightenment thinkers such as Rousseau and Voltaire. These readings fed a growing intellectual hunger and shaped his evolving views on society, governance, and human ambition. He filled numerous notebooks with his own reflections, writing on subjects ranging from history and geography to the political history of his beloved Corsica. In these personal writings, the young officer wrestled with his dual identity. Was he a Frenchman, bound to the service of the king, or was he a Corsican patriot, devoted to the liberation of his native island from foreign rule? This tension remained a constant undertone in his thoughts, driving him to seek frequent leaves of absence so he could return to Corsica and participate in the turbulent local politics led by figures like Pasquale Paoli. Yet destiny had larger plans that would soon render these local political struggles a mere stepping stone to a much grander stage. While Napoleon quietly studied and drilled in provincial garrisons, the foundations of the old French order were beginning to crack. For decades, the Kingdom of France had been strained by mounting financial debt, social inequality, and administrative paralysis. The absolute monarchy under King Louis Roman XVI found itself trapped between the extravagant demands of the royal court and the desperate needs of an overtaxed population. By the late 1780s, these economic pressures reached a breaking point. Harvest failures drove up the price of bread, plunging ordinary workers and peasants into deep distress, while the educated middle class, the bourgeoisie, grew increasingly resentful of the privileges enjoyed by the nobility and the clergy. Whispers of reform turned into loud demands for justice, representation, and fundamental change. When the royal government finally summoned the Estates General in the spring of 1789 to address the financial crisis, it unwittingly unleashed a torrent of political energy that could no longer be contained. The storm of the French Revolution had begun. For an ambitious, low-ranking officer like Napoleon, the collapse of the old order was not a tragedy. It was an unprecedented opportunity. In the traditional royal army, his career would have stalled at the rank of captain, blocked permanently by officers of high birth. The revolution, by challenging the very concept of inherited privilege, shattered the old career ceilings. As noble officers fled France in large numbers to escape the rising tide of radicalism, the military hierarchy was left vacant and destabilized. Experienced officers were desperately needed to defend the new republic against both internal revolts and external coalitions of European monarchies eager to crush the revolution before it could spread. Napoleon recognized this seismic shift instantly. When his regiment was granted leave or stationed near areas of civil unrest, he observed the political upheavals with sharp, calculating eyes. He aligned himself cautiously with the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and national unity, seeing in them a rational reorganization of society that matched his own meritocratic worldview. In his home island of Corsica, the revolution was felt with equal force. Pasquale Paoli returned from British exile as a national hero, and the Bonaparte family quickly involved themselves in the island's new political assemblies. Napoleon secured a promotion to first lieutenant and spent extended periods in Corsica, attempting to navigate the complex, often violent factional politics of the island. He sought military command within the newly formed National Guard, attempting to build a local power base that would satisfy both his nationalist impulses and his personal ambitions. However, Corsican politics proved to be a chaotic theater of personal rivalries, clan loyalties, and shifting alliances, far removed from the cold logic of mathematics and artillery ranges. Napoleon's intense ambition and uncompromising personality soon clashed with Paoli and other local leaders, creating a widening rift that would eventually force a definitive choice between his Corsican origins and his rising destiny within the French military machine. Back on the mainland, the political atmosphere in France grew increasingly volatile. The king's failed attempt to flee the country in 1791 destroyed the remaining trust between the monarchy and the revolutionary public, leading directly to the declaration of the First French Republic in 1792. The nation was now at war with a coalition of foreign powers, and the revolutionary government faced existential threats on every front. Officers who possessed genuine technical skill, unwavering discipline, and a deep understanding of modern warfare were suddenly in critical demand. Napoleon, now a captain thanks to the rapid expansion of the army and the departure of aristocratic officers, found himself in a position to put his years of quiet study into active practice. He experienced firsthand the chaotic energy of revolutionary crowds in Paris, witnessing the storming of the Tuileries Palace and the overthrow of the monarchy. These vivid sights left a permanent impression on his understanding of mob psychology, public authority, and the absolute necessity of maintaining order through strength and decisive action. The young artillery officer who had once walked the lonely corridors of Brienne and spent his meager pay on books in Valence was no longer an outsider looking in. The old world of inherited titles and locked doors was gone forever, swept away by the revolutionary storm. In its place stood a turbulent, dangerous, but wide-open new world where talent, calculation, and daring could carry an unknown officer to the heights of power. Napoleon Bonaparte stood ready, his mind sharp, his ambition burning, and his artillery pieces primed for the challenges that lay ahead. The autumn air of 1793 hung heavy with smoke, tension, and the unmistakable scent of crisis over the southern coast of France. The vital naval port and city of Toulon, a cornerstone of French maritime power, had committed an act of supreme betrayal against the fledgling republic. Frightened and disillusioned by the escalating radicalism of the National Convention in Paris, the city's royalist factions and conservative leaders had handed the harbor and its massive fortifications directly over to the British Mediterranean fleet. For the revolutionary government, this was far more than a localized rebellion. It was an open dagger pointed at the heart of France. Admiral Samuel Hood's formidable British warships, alongside allied Spanish and Neapolitan vessels, now crowded the sparkling waters of the harbor, transforming Toulon into an armed fortress defended by thousands of coalition troops. The recapture of Toulon was an absolute necessity for the survival of the Republic, yet the military commanders on the ground were floundering in a sea of confusion, hesitation, and incompetence. The siege had stalled into a slow, demoralizing stalemate. The senior commanders lacked a coherent strategy, launching uncoordinated infantry assaults that achieved nothing against the formidable stone walls and well-placed batteries of the defenders. It was into this chaotic and desperate environment that Captain Napoleon Bonaparte arrived, carrying little more than his artillery manuals, a fierce reputation for dedication, and an unshakable confidence in his own calculations. Napoleon had been assigned to the army besieging Toulon due to a fortunate combination of circumstances and connections. His predecessor as commander of the Republican artillery, a senior officer named Damartin, had been severely wounded in an early skirmish, leaving a sudden vacancy in a branch of service that was dangerously under-equipped and poorly organized. Napoleon seized the opportunity with characteristic intensity. Upon inspecting the Republican lines, his sharp analytical mind immediately diagnosed the fatal flaw in the ongoing siege operations. The previous commanders had been wasting precious men and munitions by attempting to bombard the heavily fortified city walls directly from a distance, completely ignoring the unique geography of the Toulon harbor. Napoleon looked past the immediate stone ramparts and studied the surrounding hills and peninsulas that overlooked the inner and outer anchorages where the British fleet lay at anchor. He realized with absolute clarity that capturing the city walls was secondary. The true key to Toulon was commanding the heights. If Republican artillery could be hauled up to the steep, rocky promontory known as the Exile Peninsula, a ridge colloquially dubbed Little Gibraltar by the defenders, artillery fire could rain down directly upon the anchorage. Without a safe harbor protected from French cannon fire, the British fleet would be forced to evacuate the bay, leaving the garrison isolated, defenseless, and entirely at the mercy of the Republican infantry. It was a brilliant, elegant, and audacious plan, yet convincing the senior generals required a level of persuasion and tactical authority that a mere captain rarely possessed. The commanding generals of the Army of the Alps and the Army of Italy, who had been rotated through the siege command with dizzying frequency, were initially skeptical of the young Corsican's bold assertions. They viewed him as an intense, overly vocal junior officer with strange ideas and an aggressive demeanor. However, Napoleon's relentless persistence, combined with his undeniable mastery of artillery science and logistics, gradually wore down their resistance. Given a modest allocation of guns, ammunition, and men, Napoleon set to work with a furious energy that transformed the entire atmosphere of the Republican camp. He scoured the surrounding countryside for every available cannon, mortar, and heavy siege piece, scouring abandoned depots, nearby garrisons, and coastal batteries. He personally supervised the positioning of the guns, working shoulder to shoulder with the common soldiers, hauling ropes, lifting heavy timber, and ignoring the cold rain and biting winds of the Mediterranean winter. He understood that morale was as crucial as metallurgy, and he earned the fierce loyalty of his gunners by sharing their hardships and demonstrating a profound competence that inspired complete trust. Under his meticulous direction, new batteries were carved into the steep hillsides overnight, positioned with geometric precision to maximize their field of fire, while remaining protected from enemy counter-battery attacks. The soldiers affectionately dubbed Napoleon's primary battery the Battery of the Fearless, a testament to the reckless courage with which the young captain continually exposed himself to enemy fire while sighting his guns. Day and night, the Republican camps buzzed with purposeful activity, a stark contrast to the sluggish and disorganized routine that had characterized the siege's early months. The coalition forces inside Toulon, and aboard the British ships initially dismissed the growing threat on the surrounding heights, failing to recognize the speed and determination with which the young artillery officer was tightening the noose around their position. They remained confident in the strength of their naval guns and the thick stone walls of the city's outlying redoubts. But that false sense of security was shattered on the rainy night of December 16, 1793. Following a torrential downpour that obscured their movements, Napoleon launched a meticulously coordinated, multi-pronged assault on the primary Allied fortification guarding the Exile Ridge, known as Fort Malbrouck, or Little Gibraltar. Napoleon led the attack personally, marching at the head of his columns with a bayonet fixed to his musket, shouting encouragement to his men as they scrambled up the steep, muddy slopes under a hail of grape shot and musket fire. In the violent, chaotic melee that followed, a British sergeant thrust a bayonet deep into Napoleon's thigh, inflicting a painful wound that bled profusely. Despite the agony and the heavy loss of blood, Napoleon refused to leave the field, remaining on his feet to direct the final surge that overwhelmed the fort's defenders and secured the vital summit. With Little Gibraltar firmly in Republican hands, the tactical situation in Toulon transformed instantly and irrevocably. The very next morning, Napoleon's heavy siege guns were dragged to the summit and swung into position, pointing directly down at the British fleet anchored in the harbor below. A relentless storm of iron shot and explosive shells began to rain down upon the wooden war vessels. Admiral Hood realized with horror that the harbor had become a death trap. The British ships were forced to weigh anchor and cut their cables in a desperate scramble to escape the deadly plunging fire from the heights. As the Allied fleet retreated into the open sea, the defensive foundation of the city crumbled away. Panic swept through the royalist garrison and the civilian leadership, who suddenly found themselves abandoned by the naval power that had promised them absolute protection. Republican infantry, led by the energetic General Dugommier and spurred on by the artillery triumph, surged forward into the city streets. The recapture of Toulon was complete, a stunning and decisive victory achieved largely through the visionary tactical insight and relentless drive of a 24-year-old artillery captain. The victory at Toulon sent shockwaves through the military hierarchy and the political corridors of revolutionary France. In an era desperate for heroes and military competence, Napoleon's name was suddenly on the lips of the ruling politicians in Paris, including influential figures like Maximilien Robespierre's younger brother, Augustin. For his extraordinary service, brilliance, and bravery under fire, Napoleon was promoted to the rank of brigadier general at the remarkably young age of 24. He was no longer an obscure, impoverished officer struggling for recognition in dusty provincial garrisons. He had stepped onto the national stage as a proven military commander of exceptional talent. The siege of Toulon proved to be the pivotal turning point in his life, the moment where preparation met opportunity and forged an unshakable belief in his own destiny. Yet this rapid rise also exposed him to the dangerous crosscurrents of revolutionary politics. As the chaotic tides of the terror ebbed and flowed in Paris, association with political factions could elevate an officer to the heights of power one month and send him to the guillotine the next. General Napoleon Bonaparte had tasted victory, and his ambition, now ignited by success, refused to be extinguished by the shifting political winds of a fractured nation. He packed his meager belongings, tended to his healing wound, and cast his gaze toward the horizon, fully aware that the battle for Toulon was only the opening chapter of a much larger, more dangerous journey that would soon reshape the destiny of France and the entire European continent. The triumphant smoke of Toulon had barely cleared when the young and newly minted General Napoleon Bonaparte found himself thrust into the chaotic and deeply perilous political arena of revolutionary Paris. The victory in the South had brought him a rapid promotion to brigadier general, a title that carried immense prestige but very little actual security in a capital consumed by paranoia, factionalism, and the constant terror of the guillotine. Paris in the mid-1790s was a city of sharp contrasts, where extreme poverty and opulent luxury lived side by side, and where every political conversation carried the weight of life and death. For Napoleon, a man of intense ambition and calculated discipline, the capital was a dangerous labyrinth of shifting alliances, backroom deals, and hostile committees. His association with Augustin Robespierre, the younger brother of the infamous Maximilien Robespierre, had helped secure his promotion and military assignments, but it would soon become a heavy burden. The political winds in Paris shifted with terrifying speed, and the fall of the Robespierre brothers during the bloody events of Thermidor in July 1794 plunged Napoleon directly into the crosshairs of the new regime. Stripped of his command, viewed with intense suspicion by the Committee of Public Safety, and labeled a dangerous radical or a partisan of the fallen Jacobins, Napoleon suddenly found himself arrested and placed under close confinement. He was held at the Château d'Antibes and later faced questioning in Paris, his liberty hanging by a thread while his future looked bleak and uncertain. Yet, even in the cold and oppressive confines of imprisonment, Napoleon did not despair. His mind remained razor-sharp, constantly analyzing maps, studying historical campaigns, and pondering his next move. His freedom was eventually restored after influential friends and pragmatic administrators recognized his undeniable military talent and the absurdity of accusing a dedicated artillery officer of treasonous political plots. However, freedom in revolutionary Paris did not mean stability or employment. Napoleon found himself stranded in the capital without a military commission, living in modest, rented rooms on meager half-pay, watching his savings dwindle while the nation drifted through economic chaos and political paralysis under the corrupt and inefficient Directorate. These were months of frustration, introspection, and bitter poverty for the ambitious Corsican. He spent long hours walking the bustling streets of Paris, observing the extravagant fashions of the newly rich alongside the desperate hunger of the working poor. He visited libraries, frequented cafes where politicians and journalists debated the fate of the nation, and cultivated relationships with influential figures who might help resurrect his stalled career. Among these contacts was Paul Barras, a powerful and influential member of the ruling Directorate, who recognized Napoleon's sharp intellect, fierce drive, and potential usefulness to a government constantly besieged by enemies from both the left and the right. The Directorate, struggling to maintain order against a deeply dissatisfied populace and growing threats from royalist factions determined to restore the Bourbon monarchy, desperately needed competent military officers who were willing to act decisively without hesitation. That desperate need culminated in the explosive crisis of 13 Vendémiaire in the late autumn of 1795. The royalist factions in Paris, emboldened by public anger over the failing economy and the heavy-handed policies of the government, organized a massive armed insurrection. More than 20,000 royalist insurgents poured into the streets of Paris, converging on the center of government with the clear intention of storming the National Convention and overthrowing the Directorate. The government forces inside the Tuileries Palace were severely outnumbered, panicked, and commanded by General Menu, who lacked the stomach to confront the enormous crowd and attempted to negotiate a disastrous truce. As panic gripped the government leadership, Paul Barras remembered the intense, diminutive artillery general from Corsica who had saved the day at Toulon. Napoleon was summoned urgently to the headquarters of the convention and asked if he could save the Republic from the advancing royalist mob. Napoleon did not hesitate. He surveyed the desperate situation with characteristic calmness and immediately grasped that half measures would result in slaughter and defeat. He dispatched one of his most trusted cavalry officers, Joachim Murat, on a frantic midnight dash to seize the heavy artillery stored at the Sablons camp before the insurgents could capture the guns. Murat returned just in time, bringing 40 cannon through the dark streets of Paris to the approaches of the Tuileries Palace. When the royalist forces advanced the next morning, confident in their overwhelming numbers and certain that the Republican soldiers would refuse to fire upon their fellow citizens, Napoleon met them with brutal, unyielding resolve. He positioned his artillery at the strategic choke points leading to the palace, commanding the narrow streets and bridges with deadly precision. As the massive crowd surged forward, shouting slogans against the government and attempting to breach the defensive lines, Napoleon gave the order to fire. The roar of the cannon shattered the morning calm, unleashing a devastating storm of grapeshot down the narrow Parisian thoroughfares. The impact was immediate and terrifying. The dense columns of insurgents were torn apart by the relentless iron fire, shattering their morale and driving them into panicked flight. Napoleon continued to direct the artillery barrage with absolute cool-headedness, ensuring that the rebellion was thoroughly crushed within a matter of hours. The streets around the church of Saint-Troch and the Tuileries Palace were cleared, leaving the revolutionary government miraculously secure, and Napoleon the undisputed savior of the regime. The events of 13 Vendémiaire transformed Napoleon's fortunes overnight. He was promoted to commander of the Army of the Interior, and suddenly found himself elevated to the highest circles of French power, wealth, and influence. No longer an impoverished, suspected outsider lurking in the shadows of Paris, he was now recognized as the indispensable military defender of the state. He frequented the most elite salons, rubbed shoulders with government ministers and diplomats, and caught the eye of the sophisticated and well-connected society beauty Joséphine de Beauharnais, a romance that would soon alter the course of his personal and public life. Yet, even as he enjoyed the newfound luxury and status that came with his victory, Napoleon remained acutely aware of the fragile and volatile nature of Parisian politics. He understood that his power rested entirely on his military success and his ability to deliver victories for a restless nation. The streets of Paris had provided him with a platform, but his true destiny lay beyond the capital, waiting on the sun-drenched battlefields of Europe where real empires were forged. With the domestic threat neutralized and his reputation firmly cemented, Napoleon prepared himself for the next great leap, casting his ambitious gaze toward the fractured kingdoms of Italy, where the Directory was about to hand him the ultimate command of a neglected, starving army. The boy from Corsica had survived the dangerous alleys of revolutionary Paris, and he was now ready to unleash his tactical genius upon a world that had not yet learned to fear his name. The contrast between the glittering, superficial luxury of Parisian salons and the desperate, miserable reality of the French military forces stationed on the Italian frontier could not have been starker. While politicians in the capital dined on fine china and debated the future of the Republic over expensive wines, the soldiers of the Army of Italy lived in a state of agonizing neglect. When young General Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at his new headquarters in Nice in the spring of 1796, he found an army that existed almost entirely on paper. The Directory had promised an invading force of nearly 40,000 battle-ready troops, but Napoleon discovered a demoralized, starving, and half-naked rabble of barely 30,000 men. They lacked proper clothing, adequate boots, horses for transport, artillery equipment, and even basic rations. Rain leaked through their ragged tents, disease swept unchecked through their camps, and months of unpaid wages had driven morale down to the absolute breaking point. Desertion was rampant, discipline had collapsed, and veteran officers looked upon the scrawny, 26-year-old Corsican general with thinly veiled skepticism and outright mockery. They whispered behind his back, doubting that this pale, intense bookworm could command an army of hardened veterans, let alone lead them to victory against the formidable military power of the Kingdom of Sardinia and the vast, highly trained imperial forces of the Austrian Empire. Napoleon, however, was entirely undaunted by the monumental scale of the crisis. He possessed an extraordinary capacity to look past external wretchedness and see raw potential, matching his boundless willpower against the seemingly impossible odds stacked heavily against him. Within hours of taking command, Napoleon summoned his senior divisional commanders, men like Pierre Augereau, André Massena, and Jean-Mathieu Philibert-Sérurier, veterans twice his age who initially expected to easily manipulate or ignore their young superior. Instead, they were stunned into silence by Napoleon's intense gaze, his absolute mastery of detail, and his fiery, hypnotic eloquence. In a short, electrifying address that would become legendary in military history, Napoleon told his starving, barefoot soldiers precisely what they needed to hear. He offered them no easy comforts, no warm beds, and no guaranteed safety, but instead made a stark and brutal bargain. Soldiers, he declared, you are naked, underfed, and poorly paid. The government owes you much, but it can give you nothing. Your patience and courage are admirable, but they bring you neither glory nor profit. I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. Rich provinces, great cities will be in your power. There you will find honor, glory, and wealth. Soldiers of the army of Italy, will you lack courage or constancy? The speech struck deep into the hearts of the weary men, transforming their despair into a fierce, burning hunger for victory and redemption. It was not merely a call to arms. It was a psychological revolution that instantly bound the soldiers to their commander with an unbreakable bond of absolute trust and fierce loyalty. Napoleon immediately set to work with frantic, tireless energy to transform the broken army into an efficient killing machine. He ruthlessly purged corrupt contractors, cracked down on theft and insubordination, reorganized the supply lines, and demanded absolute accountability from every officer. He slept for only a few hours a night, reading maps by candlelight, writing dozens of orders, dispatches, and proclamations, and personally inspecting outposts to ensure that his strict new standards were being met across the entire front. He understood that an army moving on its stomach could not wait for slow supply wagons dragged through the snow-blocked alpine passes, so he prepared a bold, radical operational strategy. Instead of relying on traditional, slow-moving logistical tales, Napoleon's army would live off the conquered land, moving with lightning speed and striking the enemy before they could concentrate their superior numbers. The geopolitical map of northern Italy in 1796 was a fractured chessboard divided among several distinct states. To the west lay the kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, an ally of Austria, while the rich plains of Lombardy and Milan were controlled by the Austrian Empire under the command of veteran generals like Feldjugmeister Beaulieu. The Austrian and Sardinian forces together outnumbered the French army significantly, holding strong defensive positions in the rugged, treacherous terrain of the maritime Alps and the Apennines. Conventional military wisdom dictated that Napoleon should wait for reinforcements, secure his rear, and fight a cautious war of attrition. But Napoleon despised caution when it stood in the path of swift, decisive glory. He decided to exploit the fatal flaw of the coalition, the deep mistrust and physical separation between the Austrian and Sardinian armies. By driving his fast-moving columns directly through the narrow gap where the Alps met the Apennines at the historic town of Montenotte, Napoleon intended to wedge his forces between the two allied armies, isolating them from one another and defeating them in detail before they could unite their massive strength. The campaign opened in mid-April 1796 with a breathtaking display of speed, audacity, and tactical genius that caught the Allied commanders completely by surprise. While the enemy expected the French to advance along the coastal roads in predictable fashion, Napoleon hurled his ragged divisions directly through the mountain passes in the freezing spring rain. At the Battle of Montenotte on April 12, 1796, Napoleon struck the Austrian vanguard under General Argenteau with crushing force, surrounding their positions and driving them into chaotic retreat. It was Napoleon's first major independent victory as an army commander, and its psychological impact was immediate. The myth of Austrian invulnerability was shattered in a single afternoon, and the French soldiers realized that their young general's bold promises were entirely real. Following Montenotte, Napoleon did not pause to rest or celebrate. He pivoted his forces with astonishing rapidity, marching day and night through difficult mountain terrain to strike the Sardinian army at Dago and Millesimo. The Allied commanders were left staggering, unable to keep pace with the relentless French tempo. Beaulieu's Austrian forces were forced to retreat eastward toward Milan to protect the Lombard plains, while the Sardinian army reeled backward toward Turin, utterly shattered and terrified by the unstoppable French advance. In less than 2 weeks of intense campaigning, Napoleon had successfully driven a deep wedge between the Austrian and Piedmontese armies, completely neutralizing the coalition's strategic advantage. The Kingdom of Piedmont-Sardinia, facing imminent invasion and total collapse, sued for an immediate armistice, signing the Treaty of Cherasco on April 28, which effectively knocked Sardinia out of the war and handed crucial strategic fortresses over to French control. With his western flank entirely secured, and his army enriched by captured supplies, weapons, and money, Napoleon turned his full attention toward the remaining Austrian forces across the Po River. The Austrians sought to make a stand along the strategic river crossings, establishing a heavily defended bridgehead at the ancient town of Lodi in early May 1796. The Battle of Lodi would become one of the most famous and defining moments of Napoleon's early career, cementing his reputation as a fearless leader who shared the extreme dangers of the front line alongside his men. The Austrian rear guard, numbering several thousand troops backed by numerous heavy cannon, guarded the long, narrow wooden bridge spanning the wide and swift waters of the Adda River. As the French vanguard approached, they found themselves facing a deadly wall of artillery fire sweeping the entire length of the wooden span, making a direct frontal assault seemingly suicidal. Under a hail of Austrian grapeshot and musket fire that tore through the vanguard, French infantry hesitated at the head of the bridge, pinned down by the relentless metal storm. Recognizing the critical danger of hesitation, Napoleon did not order a retreat. Instead, he rushed forward to the front lines himself, exposing his own life to the enemy fire alongside his senior officers, including Berthier, Lannes, and Massena. Gathering a dense column of brave grenadiers, Napoleon personally formed them at the bridge entrance and gave the order to charge straight across the narrow wooden structure into the face of the Austrian cannons. Through a blinding cloud of smoke and flying iron, the French soldiers surged forward in a dense mass, singing revolutionary songs and shouting their devotion to their general. The sheer psychological intensity of the charge broke the Austrian resolve. Before the French could close for hand-to-hand combat, the Austrian artillery crews were overrun, and their infantry fled in panic, leaving the strategic crossing firmly in French hands. Napoleon later wrote that it was only after the Battle of Lodi that he realized his true potential and understood that he was capable of achieving great historical deeds. Following the victory at Lodi, Napoleon entered the magnificent city of Milan in triumph, welcomed by cheering crowds who viewed the French not merely as conquerors, but as liberators bringing the progressive ideals of the Enlightenment and the Revolution to northern Italy. The wealthy aristocracy and the common people alike marveled at the diminutive Corsican general, whose electrifying energy and stunning string of lightning victories had humbled the mighty Austrian Empire in a matter of weeks. But the war was far from over. The Austrian High Command, humiliated by their rapid defeats, dispatched successive relief armies under veteran generals like Field Marshal Dagobert von Wurmser and later Alvinczi to break the French siege of the great fortress city of Mantua. This phase of the Italian campaign evolved into a complex, high-stakes game of high-speed strategic chess across the Italian plains and river valleys. Napoleon was frequently outnumbered by the fresh Austrian armies pouring down from the Alps, but he continuously compensated for his numerical inferiority through superior intelligence, rapid interior lines of communication, and astonishing forced marches that allowed him to concentrate his smaller forces at decisive points on the battlefield. At the ferocious battles of Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli, Napoleon repeatedly outmaneuvered and outfought experienced Austrian commanders, who simply could not comprehend his fluid, aggressive style of warfare. At the swampy bridge of Arcole in November 1796, Napoleon personally seized a tricolor flag and charged across the bullet-swept causeway when his men faltered, saving the day through sheer personal bravery and theatrical leadership. At Rivoli in January 1797, he masterfully managed a complex multi-front defensive battle, turning a potential defeat into a magnificent tactical masterpiece that destroyed the final major Austrian relief force. By the spring of 1797, after driving deep into Austrian territory and pushing to within striking distance of Vienna itself, Napoleon had forced the Austrian emperor to sue for peace, culminating in the signing of the preliminary Peace of Leoben and later the Treaty of Campo Formio. The Italian campaign was an unmitigated military triumph that completely transformed the geopolitical landscape of Europe. Napoleon had conquered northern Italy, created new allied republics, enriched the French treasury with millions of francs in art treasures, gold, and supplies, and demonstrated a level of strategic brilliance not seen in Europe since the days of Julius Caesar. More importantly, the campaign fundamentally altered Napoleon's own identity and public standing. He was no longer merely a talented artillery officer or a successful domestic enforcer for a fragile government. He was now the undisputed military titan of his age, an independent commander who negotiated treaties with foreign empires, commanded the absolute adoration of his battle-hardened troops, and captured the awed imagination of the entire European continent. The boy from Corsica had stepped onto the dusty roads of Italy as an unknown, desperate general leading a starving rabble, and he returned across the Alps as a legendary conqueror, whose name was whispered with a mixture of terror and reverence from Paris to St. Petersburg. The return of General Napoleon Bonaparte to Paris in the late autumn of 1797 was not merely the homecoming of a successful military commander. It was the arrival of a national savior. For years, the French populace had grown weary of the corruption, instability, and endless economic turmoil of the Directory. The revolution had promised liberty, equality, and fraternity, but it had too often delivered chaos, terror, and empty cupboards. Into this atmosphere of profound national fatigue stepped Napoleon, a young general who had single-handedly rewritten the map of northern Italy, humbled the mighty Austrian Empire, and filled the public treasury with the spoils of glorious victories. The contrast between the stumbling politicians in Paris and the brilliant, victorious general in the field could not have been more striking. Across France, newspapers printed glowing accounts of his exploits, detailing his daring charges across the bridges of Lodi and Arcole, his intellectual mastery, and his magnanimity toward defeated foes. Poets wrote verses in his honor, street vendors sold cheap copper engravings of his likeness, and ordinary citizens crowded into public squares simply to catch a glimpse of the pale, intense Corsican whose name was now synonymous with glory and national pride. Napoleon, however, understood the intoxicating power of public perception better than anyone else of his era. He knew that raw military victories alone were not enough to secure permanent greatness in the volatile political climate of Paris. Upon his return, he deliberately cultivated an aura of quiet modesty and studied detachment. While the Directory eagerly prepared grand, theatrical public celebrations to honor him at the Luxembourg Palace, complete with classical arches, patriotic music, and thunderous applause from thousands of adoring spectators, Napoleon subtly distanced himself from the corrupt politicians who sought to bask in his reflected glory. He wore plain civilian clothes rather than his full military uniform, attended meetings of the prestigious Institut de France, where he mingled with leading scientists, mathematicians, and writers, and kept his public appearances carefully calculated and rare. By refusing to look like an ambitious warlord, he cleverly avoided alarming the suspicious Republican politicians, while simultaneously driving the public's fascination to unprecedented heights. Every word he spoke, every gesture he made, and every salon he visited was scrutinized and amplified by a captivated populace, transforming him from a mortal soldier into a legendary figure of almost mythic proportions. Central to this dramatic rise in personal status was Napoleon's tempestuous and consuming romance with Joséphine de Beauharnais. They had married in a swift civil ceremony in March 1796, just days before Napoleon departed to take command of the army of Italy. Joséphine, a graceful and sophisticated Creole widow with deep connections to Parisian high society, possessed a social elegance and charm that the awkward, intense young officer desperately lacked. During the long, grueling months of the Italian campaign, Napoleon had written her a torrent of passionate, deeply emotional love letters from the battlefield, baring his soul and expressing a love that bordered on obsession, even when her replies were sparse, and she remained safely ensconced in the luxurious salons of Paris. When Napoleon finally returned from Italy, their reunion was complex, charged with the tension of her social maneuvering and his overwhelming fame. Yet, in the public eye, they were the ultimate romantic couple, the brilliant conqueror and the fashionable, beautiful aristocrat who embodied the grace of the new French elite. Joséphine's salon became a vital political and social hub where generals, intellectuals, artists, and diplomats gathered under Napoleon's watchful eye. Through her, Napoleon bridged the dangerous gap between the rough, egalitarian spirit of the Revolutionary Army and the refined, cultured traditions of the old French aristocracy, integrating both worlds into a new social hierarchy that looked directly to him as its center of gravity. The Directory watched Napoleon's meteoric rise with a mixture of awe, jealousy, and deep-seated terror. The 5 directors who ruled France recognized that this 28-year-old general possessed a level of popular adoration that completely eclipsed their own fragile authority. They feared that if Napoleon remained in Paris, he might use his immense prestige to overthrow the government and seize absolute power for himself. Eager to remove him from the capital without sparking a public outcry, the government initially considered naming him commander of an army intended for the invasion of Great Britain. But Napoleon, possessing a strategic mind that looked far beyond standard military assignments, quickly realized that a cross-channel invasion was premature and fraught with unnecessary risks. Instead, he directed his ambition toward a grander, more exotic horizon, an expedition to Egypt. An Egyptian campaign offered multiple dazzling attractions. It would disrupt British trade routes to India, expand French scientific and cultural influence in the East, and above all, keep Napoleon's name alive in the public consciousness, while the corrupt Directory slowly collapsed under the weight of its own administrative failures. By the time Napoleon began planning for the Mediterranean enterprise, the collective imagination of France was utterly captured. The belief was no longer confined to his soldiers in the field. It was a nationwide conviction that Napoleon Bonaparte was a man touched by destiny, destined for something far greater than ordinary military command. He was seen not just as a general of the Republic, but as the embodiment of France's highest aspirations, a modern Alexander, the Great, poised to conquer the world and reshape history according to his unyielding will. The horizon of the Mediterranean Sea shimmered under a blinding sun as a colossal fleet of more than 400 ships cut through the blue waters in the spring of 1798. This was no ordinary military deployment. Aboard the flagship, the Orient, stood General Napoleon Bonaparte, flanked not only by seasoned generals and veteran infantrymen, but also by a hand-picked battalion of civilian scholars, scientists, engineers, cartographers, and artists. Known as the Commission of Sciences and Arts of Egypt, this extraordinary group included mathematicians like Gaspard Monge, chemists like Claude Louis Berthollet, and artists who would meticulously document every monument, ruin, and artifact they encountered. Napoleon's ambition was never merely territorial. He viewed himself as a modern conqueror in the tradition of Alexander the Great, determined to merge military conquest with intellectual enlightenment. His destination was Egypt, an ancient and mysterious land currently ruled by the Mamluks under nominal Ottoman suzerainty. The strategic objective was clear yet audaciously vast: sever Great Britain's vital trade routes to India, establish a permanent French foothold in the Middle East, and build a new Eastern empire that would challenge European powers from a fresh vantage point. Yet, beneath the grand rhetoric of scientific discovery and liberation from Mamluk misrule, lay a pragmatic political calculation. The Directory in Paris had grown increasingly anxious about Napoleon's soaring popularity and political ambitions. By dispatching him to the distant sands of North Africa, the fearful politicians hoped to distance themselves from a dangerous rival, while Napoleon willingly accepted the gamble, believing that a bold stroke in the East would only enhance his legendary status upon his inevitable return to Europe. The journey across the Mediterranean began with swift and calculated strokes. Before launching his main assault on the Egyptian mainland, Napoleon targeted the island of Malta, a heavily fortified stronghold governed by the Knights Hospitaller. For centuries, the island had stood as an impregnable maritime bastion. However, weakened by internal decay and internal divisions, Malta offered little sustained resistance to Napoleon's overwhelming force. In June 1798, French troops landed across the rocky shores, and within days, Grand Master Hampèche capitulated, handing over the island's strategic harbors, massive stone fortifications, and vast military stores almost without a fight. Napoleon spent a few intensely productive days on the island, swiftly reorganizing its administration, abolishing feudal privileges and slavery, and modernizing its legal and educational systems before pressing forward toward his ultimate objective. He left behind a strong garrison and sailed onward, skillfully evading the pursuing British fleet commanded by Admiral Horatio Nelson, whose warships narrowly missed intercepting the French armada in the foggy Mediterranean nights. By July, the towering minarets and sun-baked coastline of Alexandria hove into view, marking the dramatic beginning of the Egyptian campaign's perilous next phase. The landing at Alexandria was executed with characteristic speed and urgency, despite turbulent seas and the looming threat of hostile defenders. Napoleon did not wait for his heavy artillery to be unloaded before ordering an assault on the ancient city. Leading from the front, French infantry forces scaled the medieval walls and overwhelmed the defenders in a swift, sharp engagement. Once secure in Alexandria, Napoleon immediately issued a series of carefully crafted proclamations designed to win over the local population. Drawing on his genius for psychological warfare and political theater, he addressed the Egyptian people not as a foreign conqueror, but as a liberator who respected Islam, revered the Quran, and sought to free them from the oppressive tyranny of the Mamluk ruling caste. He established local divans, councils of prominent local citizens and religious leaders, to help govern the city and demonstrate respect for local customs and laws, attempting to bridge the profound cultural divide between the European army and the indigenous population. From Alexandria, the French army began its grueling march southeast toward Cairo, cutting directly across the arid, unforgiving expanse of the western desert. The conditions were immediate and brutal. The scorching summer heat radiated off the sand, water supplies dwindled rapidly, uniform woolens proved suffocatingly heavy, and harassing bands of Bedouin raiders struck out from hidden dunes before vanishing back into the desert. Morale among the weary soldiers plummeted, and murmurs of discontent echoed through the ranks. To counter the growing despair, Napoleon marched alongside his men, sharing their hardships, conversing with common soldiers, and maintaining an unwavering outward confidence that inspired both awe and stubborn loyalty. He instituted strict discipline regarding water conservation and looting, ensuring that the army remained cohesive despite the agonizing physical toll of the march. The culmination of this grueling trek arrived on July 21, 1798, near the village of Mbebe, within sight of the legendary pyramids of Giza. Here, the Mamluk cavalry, resplendent in silk robes, turbans, and chainmail, waiting with flashing sabers and centuries-old military traditions, prepared to meet the modern French army. The opposing forces presented a stark historical contrast. On one side stood the fierce, feudal horsemen of the East, famed for their reckless personal bravery and unmatched horsemanship. On the other stood the disciplined, tactical squares of the French Revolutionary Army, veterans of European battlefields armed with standardized muskets and coordinated artillery batteries. As the Mamluk cavalry surged forward in a thunderous, ground-shaking charge, their magnificent horses and flashing blades glittering in the blinding desert sun, Napoleon calmly surveyed the field. He famously delivered an address to his men that would echo through history. "Soldiers, from the summit of yonder pyramids, 40 centuries look down upon you. The tactical execution of the Battle of the Pyramids was a masterclass in modern infantry defense. Napoleon ordered his divisions to form massive, hollow rectangles or squares, facing outward in all directions. Each square bristled with rows of bayonets, supported by light artillery placed at the corners. The charging Mamluks crashed like waves against a rock, unable to break the disciplined walls of lead and steel, and decimated by devastating point-blank artillery fire. The elite cavalry horses panicked and threw their riders into disarray. Wave after wave of charges broke fruitlessly against the French formations. Recognizing the hopelessness of the cavalry assault, the Mamluk leadership attempted a disorganized retreat, many attempting to cross the wide waters of the Nile under heavy French fire. The victory was decisive and overwhelming. The Mamluk military power in Egypt was effectively shattered in a single afternoon, leaving thousands of enemy dead and captured, while French casualties remained remarkably light. Days later, Napoleon entered Cairo in triumph, establishing his headquarters in the city and setting up an administration intended to blend Western governance with Eastern traditions. He attended local festivals, celebrated Islamic holy days with religious leaders, and immersed himself in studying the administrative, agricultural, and commercial potential of the Nile Valley. Meanwhile, the members of the Scientific Commission plunged into their historic work, setting up laboratories, measuring ancient monuments, sketching hieroglyphics, and systematically surveying the geography, flora, and fauna of a land that had remained largely mysterious to Western science for centuries. They collected vast archives of data, discovered ancient ruins, and laid the vital groundwork for modern Egyptology, achieving a cultural breakthrough that would outlast the military campaign itself. Yet, even as Napoleon consolidated his triumphs on land, a catastrophic shadow was gathering along the Mediterranean coast. On August 1, 1798, just days after the victory at Cairo, the British Admiral Horatio Nelson finally caught up with the French fleet anchored securely in Aboukir Bay near Alexandria. Believing their position in the shallow bay to be protected by coastal batteries and difficult shoals, the French commanders settled into a defensive posture. Nelson, however, displaying his own legendary tactical audacity, ordered his warships to sail through the narrow gap between the anchored French line and the rocky shore, doubling up on the leading French vessels and catching them in a devastating crossfire. The ensuing engagement, known historically as the Battle of the Nile, was an unmitigated disaster for France. Throughout the violent night, British warships systematically dismantled the French fleet, ship by ship. The climax of the catastrophe occurred when the towering French flagship, the Orient, caught fire, its massive powder magazine detonating in a colossal, earth-shattering explosion that illuminated the night sky and left an eerie, stunned silence across the dark waters. By morning, the French fleet was almost entirely destroyed or captured, leaving only 2 ships of the line to escape to Malta. The strategic consequences of the Battle of the Nile were swift and profound. Napoleon and his entire army were now effectively stranded in Egypt, completely cut off from reinforcements, communications, and supplies from the French mainland. The grand vision of an expanding Eastern Empire suddenly shrank into an isolated military occupation surrounded by hostile populations, a vengeful Ottoman Empire, and a triumphant British Navy controlling the sea lanes. Despite the crushing naval defeat, Napoleon refused to yield to despair. He immediately turned his boundless energy toward consolidating his position in Egypt, launching further military expeditions into Syria to preempt Ottoman counteroffensives, reforming local tax structures, constructing hospitals, and promoting advanced agricultural techniques. He demonstrated an astonishing capacity to manage multiple crises simultaneously, keeping his officers focused and maintaining the loyalty of his troops, despite the growing realization of their strategic isolation. Rumors of the disasters in Egypt filtered slowly back to France, mingled with dazzling reports of scientific discoveries and the glory of the pyramids. The newspapers in Paris, manipulated by both government censors and Napoleon's own agents, often downplayed the strategic isolation while highlighting the exotic adventures and cultural triumphs of the scientific commission. Yet, the political landscape in Europe was shifting rapidly. While Napoleon governed along the banks of the Nile, a new European coalition was forming, driven by British financial subsidies, Russian military ambitions, and Austrian desires for revenge. The Directory in France was stumbling from one administrative crisis to another, proving itself utterly incapable of managing the mounting military threats on the continent or restoring economic stability at home. The stage was quietly being set for a dramatic homecoming. Napoleon realized that his glorious adventure in the sands of Egypt had reached its practical limits, and that his true destiny lay not beside the Nile, but back in the heart of Europe. Leaving his army under the command of General Kleber, Napoleon slipped away from Egypt in the summer of 1799 aboard a small frigate, deftly running the British naval blockade once again. As his ship crossed the Mediterranean toward the shores of France, carrying a general who had become both a military legend and an intellectual icon, the French Republic was teetering on the edge of total collapse, waiting impatiently for a savior to step forward and seize the reins of history. The small frigate carrying General Napoleon Bonaparte cut quietly through the dark, choppy waters of the Mediterranean Sea in the late summer of 1799. After months of tense evasion, successfully dodging British naval patrols that constantly swept the shipping lanes, the ship finally drew close to the southern coast of France. When Napoleon and a small group of his most trusted officers and scientists finally disembarked near Saint-Raphael in October 1799, they were met not with suspicion or arrest for abandoning their post in Egypt, but with wild, overwhelming jubilation. Local villagers, fishermen, and peasants rushed to the beaches to catch a glimpse of the famous general whose name had become synonymous with victory, adventure, and national glory. News of his return spread across France like wildfire, leaping from town to town and carried swiftly by ecstatic crowds and eager messengers. To the ordinary citizens of France, who were exhausted by years of political corruption, economic collapse, high inflation, and military defeats on the borders, Napoleon appeared not as a deserter, but as a legendary hero returning from the East just in time to save the Republic from total ruin. As his carriage rumbled northward along dusty roads toward Paris, crowds lined the route for miles, cheering, throwing flowers, and shouting his name. Church bells rang out in celebration, and makeshift banners hailed him as the savior of France. The Directory in Paris, weak, divided, and deeply unpopular, watched this massive public adulation with mounting terror. The politicians in power realized that their days were numbered, for no government could withstand the immense tide of popularity that now surrounded the young general from Corsica. Upon entering Paris, Napoleon found himself immediately courted by rival political factions, each desperately seeking his military support to overthrow the existing regime. Among the most influential plotters was Abbé Sieyes, a cunning politician and member of the Directory who had long believed that France needed a strong, decisive sword to establish a stable government. Sieyes recognized that the Republic's complex constitutional framework was broken, and that public order could only be restored through a swift, decisive change of power. He approached Napoleon, offering him a partnership in a carefully planned political conspiracy. At first, Napoleon held back, carefully observing the chaotic political landscape, assessing the loyalty of the military garrison in Paris, and gauging the mood of the legislative councils. He understood that a clumsy coup could easily result in execution or disgrace, but he also knew that the nation was ripe for a change. He met secretly with key military commanders, including General Moreau and Marshal Murat, securing their absolute loyalty and ensuring that the army would stand firmly behind him when the critical moment arrived. The plotters chose November 9, 1799, which corresponded to the 18th day of Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, as the date to launch their carefully choreographed move against the government. The plan was meticulously designed to combine legal maneuvering, political intimidation, and military pressure. Early on the morning of the 18th of Brumaire, military units loyal to Napoleon and CIs quietly occupied strategic locations across Paris, sealing off key intersections, seizing government printing presses, and securing bridges across the Seine. Simultaneously, members of the Council of Ancients, one of the two legislative bodies, were hurriedly summoned to an emergency early morning session. Convinced by fabricated reports of an imminent Jacobin conspiracy that threatened the stability of the state, the council voted to relocate the entire legislative assembly to the quiet palace of St. Cloud, situated just outside Paris, away from the turbulent and unpredictable crowds of the capital. To ensure absolute control and prevent any armed resistance from opposing politicians, the council also appointed Napoleon Bonaparte as commander of all military forces stationed within the capital and its surrounding districts. Armed with this sweeping legal authority, Napoleon rode out to the Tuileries Palace, surrounded by a glittering escort of cavalry officers, to address the assembled deputies. His uniform was immaculate, his demeanor calm and intensely focused. He formally accepted his new military command before the Council of Ancients, delivering a brief, stern speech in which he pledged to defend liberty, equality, and the Republic against all internal enemies. However, the true political battleground lay at St. Cloud the following day, November 10, when the two legislative chambers, the Council of Ancients and the Council of 500, convened inside the opulent halls of the palace. The deputies quickly realized that they had walked directly into a well-laid military trap. Suspicion, anger, and fierce resistance flared instantly among the Jacobin-dominated members of the Council of 500, who perceived the entire maneuver as a blatant military dictatorship in the making. As Napoleon walked into the chambers of the Council of Ancients to urge a swift vote on the proposed constitutional reforms, he was met with murmurs of disapproval and demands for constitutional legality. Realizing that polite persuasion was failing, Napoleon decided to take matters directly into his own hands. Accompanied by a small group of elite grenadiers, he marched into the heated, chaotic hall of the Council of 500. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Enraged deputies leaped from their wooden benches, surrounded the general, shoved him violently, and began screaming accusations of treason and military tyranny. Some shouted down the general, demanding that he be declared an outlaw, which carried an automatic sentence of death. The atmosphere inside the Grand Hall deteriorated into a screaming, shoving mob. In the intense confusion, Napoleon, temporarily rattled by the physical hostility and the unexpected venom of the politicians, was ushered out of the room by his loyal grenadiers just in time to avoid serious injury. Outside the hall, panic threatened to derail the entire conspiracy. Lucien Bonaparte, Napoleon's brilliant and ambitious younger brother, who was currently serving as the president of the Council of 500, acted with decisive, life-saving courage. Realizing that the situation was slipping away, Lucian mounted a horse outside the palace, rode directly up to the lines of waiting French soldiers, and addressed the troops with high theatrical flair. Drawing his sword, Lucian pointed the blade directly at Napoleon's chest and declared publicly that he would gladly run his own brother through with the weapon if Napoleon ever attempted to violate the liberties of the French people. He shouted to the soldiers that the Legislative Assembly was being held hostage by a violent minority of paid agitators and madmen armed with daggers. The effect on the elite troops was instantaneous. Enraged by the disrespect shown to their beloved general and stirred by Lucian's fiery rhetoric, the soldiers lowered their bayonets. Commanded by Joachim Murat, a column of elite grenadiers burst through the doors of the Legislative Hall, drums beating loudly to drown out the protests of the politicians. The soldiers advanced steadily down the aisles with fixed bayonets, clearing the room. The terrified deputies did not offer physical resistance. Instead, they scrambled over wooden benches, broke through windows, and fled into the gardens of St. Cloud, abandoning their papers, robes, and hats in their frantic escape. Later that same evening, under the cover of darkness, a rump session of the compliant deputies was hurriedly gathered back together. Under heavy military observation, this remaining fragment of the legislature formally voted to dissolve the Directory. In its place, they established a provisional executive government consisting of three figures known as consuls. Power was ostensibly shared between CIs, Roger Ducos, and Napoleon Bonaparte, but everyone present understood the stark reality of the situation. The nominal triumvirate was merely a diplomatic facade designed to soothe public anxiety. The true, unchallengeable center of gravity had shifted entirely to the brilliant general who had commanded the troops at Toulon, swept across the plains of Italy, and now mastered the capital of France. The coup of 18 Brumaire marked a profound and irreversible turning point in modern European history. It brought an abrupt end to the chaotic decade of the French Revolution, closing a tumultuous chapter characterized by radical terror, institutional instability, and endless political purges. At the same time, it opened a brilliant, highly centralized new era that would bear the indelible stamp of Napoleon's genius. As the smoke cleared over St. Cloud and the exhausted politicians melted into the shadows, Napoleon stood firmly at the summit of French politics, ready to reshape the nation's laws, rebuild its shattered economy, and consolidate a personal authority that would soon transform a revolutionary republic into a magnificent, continent-spanning empire. With the Directory overthrown and the chaos of the coup of 18 Brumaire pushed into the background, Napoleon Bonaparte found himself standing at the absolute center of French political life. The provisional consulate established in the dark hours at St. Cloud quickly gave way to a permanent constitutional structure, known officially as the consulate. Under the newly drafted constitution of the year Roman VIII, executive power was concentrated heavily in the hands of the first consul, while two other consuls, Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès and Charles-François Lebrun, were appointed to assist him. Their roles were primarily consultative. Napoleon held the real authority, wielding the power to appoint ministers, initiate laws, declare war, and direct foreign policy. For the first time in a decade, France had a government with a clear head, a singular vision, and an undisputed master. Yet, securing political power was only the first step. Napoleon understood that personal authority alone could not hold a fractured nation together. France was exhausted. A decade of revolution had torn apart its social fabric, emptied its treasury, fractured its religious life, and corrupted its public administration. Inflation had rendered paper money nearly worthless, roads and bridges were crumbling from neglect, and lawlessness plagued the countryside. Across Europe, hostile coalitions of foreign powers watched closely, waiting for the fragile new regime to collapse under its own weight. Napoleon realized that if he wanted to build an enduring legacy and secure his own grip on the nation, he had to solve these domestic crises swiftly and thoroughly. He needed to prove to the French people that order, prosperity, and stability could be restored without sacrificing the core social gains of the revolution. Napoleon possessed an astonishing, almost superhuman capacity for work. He routinely put in 18-hour days, devouring reports, interrogating experts, and dictating instructions with breathtaking speed and precision. He surrounded himself not with ideological zealots or aristocratic sycophants, but with brilliant, highly competent administrators drawn from both the old regime and the revolutionary factions. He famously declared that he looked only for capability, stating that it did not matter whether a man had been a royalist or a Jacobin, as long as he was competent and loyal to France. This pragmatic approach allowed him to harness the nation's best minds, creating a highly efficient technocratic state. One of Napoleon's most urgent priorities was stabilizing the national economy. When he took power, the French treasury was practically empty, and the government was drowning in debt. To restore financial confidence, Napoleon immediately instituted sweeping tax reforms. He centralized and streamlined the collection of direct and indirect taxes, ensuring that revenues actually reached the state rather than vanishing into the pockets of corrupt local officials. In January 1800, he established the Bank of France, a private institution backed by the government designed to stabilize the currency, manage the public debt, and provide reliable credit to businesses. He replaced the worthless revolutionary paper assignats with a new, stable currency based on gold and silver coins, known as the franc germinal. This new currency would remain remarkably stable for over a century, restoring faith among merchants, farmers, and everyday citizens who had suffered through years of hyperinflation. Alongside economic reform, Napoleon turned his attention to the legal chaos that had plagued France since 1789. Before the Revolution, the country was a patchwork of conflicting feudal laws, royal edicts, and regional customs, making justice unpredictable and uneven. The Revolution had attempted to write new laws, but the resulting legal code was incomplete, contradictory, and constantly shifting. Napoleon decided to create a single, unified civil code for the entire nation. He appointed a commission of eminent jurists to draft the code, and he personally presided over more than half of the legislative sessions, debating the articles with astonishing legal insight and relentless energy. Completed in 1804 and later renamed the Code Civil des Franchises, or simply the Napoleonic Code. This monumental achievement enshrined many of the core principles of the Revolution: legal equality for all citizens, religious tolerance, the abolition of feudalism, and the protection of private property. However, it also reflected Napoleon's deeply traditional views on social order, reinforcing the authority of the husband and father within the patriarchal family unit. Despite its limitations, the Napoleonic Code became a masterpiece of jurisprudence, serving as the foundation of modern legal systems throughout Europe and much of the world. Education was another cornerstone of Napoleon's vision for a reformed France. He believed that the state required an educated, disciplined administrative class and loyal officers to function effectively. While the Revolution had destroyed much of the old church-run school system, it had failed to build a comprehensive replacement. Napoleon restructured the educational landscape, establishing secondary schools known as lycées, which focused on rigorous academic study, mathematics, science, and classical literature, alongside military discipline. He also centralized the university system under the Imperial University, ensuring that the curriculum was standardized and supervised by the state. While primary education remained largely neglected during this era, these new secondary and higher education institutions created a meritocratic elite, allowing talented young men from modest backgrounds to rise through government service based on ability rather than noble birth. Perhaps one of Napoleon's most politically daring domestic initiatives was his reconciliation with the Catholic Church. The revolution had unleashed ferocious anti-clerical campaigns, confiscating church property, banishing refractory priests, and attempting to replace Catholicism with secular cults. This assault had deeply alienated millions of devout Catholics, particularly in rural regions like the Vendée, where bloody rebellions had broken out against the Republic. Napoleon, a pragmatist rather than a devout believer, understood that peace with Rome was essential to healing the wounds of the nation. He famously remarked that society could not exist without inequality of fortunes, and inequality of fortunes could not exist without religion. In 1801, after months of intense, delicate negotiations, Napoleon signed a historic concordat with Pope Pius VII. The agreement recognized Catholicism as the religion of the great majority of French citizens, while maintaining religious freedom for Protestants and Jews. Crucially, the Pope agreed to accept the permanent loss of church lands seized during the Revolution, removing a massive obstacle to social stability. In return, the French state agreed to pay the salaries of bishops and priests, effectively turning the clergy into state functionaries. By healing the deep rift between the state and the Catholic Church, Napoleon neutralized a major source of internal rebellion and won the deep gratitude of the rural population. Napoleon's domestic reforms also extended to public works, infrastructure, and urban planning. Throughout Paris and the provinces, construction projects boomed. Roads were paved, canals were dug to improve trade routes, harbors were dredged, and magnificent new monuments began to rise across the capital to celebrate the glory of the state. Crime was ruthlessly suppressed by an efficient national police force directed by the cunning and ruthless Joseph Fouché. While Fouché's secret police maintained a vast network of informers, censored newspapers, and silenced political dissidents, the average citizen experienced a level of personal safety and civil order that they had not known in over a decade. Trade flourished, urban markets buzzed with activity, and the general standard of living began to rise. As Napoleon systematically consolidated his administrative, legal, and financial triumphs, his personal authority grew absolute. He was no longer merely a general who had seized power by the sword. He was the indispensable architect of a modern, functioning state. Every ministry reported directly to him. Every major policy decision bore his personal signature, and every sphere of French life felt the driving force of his intellect. Yet, even as he rebuilt France from the ashes of revolution, his ambitions were already expanding beyond its borders. The stability he had forged at home provided him with the immense resources, the obedient population, and the national unity necessary to face the external threats of Europe. With France firmly in his grasp and his administrative machine running with clockwork precision, Napoleon looked out across the continent, preparing for the military campaigns that would soon test his genius against the oldest and most powerful monarchies of Europe. The transition of France from a republic governed by a victorious general into a formal empire was not a sudden accident of history, but the calculated culmination of years of political consolidation. By 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had thoroughly reshaped the French state, proving himself an indispensable master of administration, law, and military defense. Yet, despite holding absolute authority as first consul for life, Napoleon remained acutely aware of the deep-seated vulnerabilities of his regime. Republican diehards whispered of betrayal, royalist conspirators financed by foreign gold-plotted assassinations, and traditional European monarchies refused to recognize the legitimacy of a government born out of revolution. Napoleon understood that as long as his power rested merely on an extraordinary office within a republic, it could be undone by another sudden coup, a successful assassin's bullet, or a shifting political tide. To secure his achievements, protect his family, and guarantee the long-term stability of France, he needed to anchor his leadership in something permanent, hereditary, and unquestionable. He needed to become an emperor. The path toward the imperial crown was paved both by external threats and internal conspiracies. In the spring of 1804, a major royalist assassination plot orchestrated by Georges Cadoudal and backed by British funds was uncovered by Joseph Fouché's efficient police network. The conspiracy, which intended to strike down the first consul in the streets of Paris, also involved high-ranking figures, including the Bourbon prince, the Duke of Enghien. In a swift and ruthless display of state security, Napoleon ordered the abduction of the Duke from neutral territory in Baden, subjected him to a hasty military trial, and had him executed by firing squad in the ditch of the Château de Vincennes. While the execution sent shockwaves through the royal courts of Europe and alienated some moderate liberals, it achieved its immediate political objective inside France. It terrified opponents, demonstrated the unyielding strength of the regime, and convinced the French political elite that only a hereditary dynasty could permanently block the return of the Bourbon monarchy and the bloody chaos of the past. Seizing upon the climate of fear and the genuine public gratitude for national stability, Napoleon's loyal political allies orchestrated a coordinated campaign to petition for a change in government. Senate members, tribunes, and high-ranking military officers began publicly arguing that the safety of France required the establishment of an imperial dynasty. They maintained that a hereditary crown would unite the nation, silence royalist pretenders, and place France on an equal footing with the ancient empires of Austria, Russia, and Britain. Napoleon played his part with calculated restraint, feigning reluctance, while his ministers and senators worked tirelessly behind the scenes to draft the necessary legislation. On May 18, 1804, the Conservative Senate officially passed a motion declaring Napoleon Bonaparte Emperor of the French, provided that the French people approved the constitutional change in a national plebiscite. The subsequent plebiscite was an overwhelming popular endorsement. Across France, millions of citizens went to the polls to vote on the establishment of the empire. While modern historians debate the exact degree of administrative pressure and ballot manipulation applied by local prefects, there is no doubt that the vast majority of the French population genuinely supported Napoleon. Weary of decades of revolution, economic instability, and foreign war, ordinary citizens saw the emperor as a guarantor of peace, prosperity, and the social gains of 1789. The urban working class, the rural peasantry, and the burgeoning middle class all rallied behind the man who had brought order out of chaos. The plebiscite delivered a massive landslide in favor of the imperial constitution, confirming that Napoleon's ambition was fully backed by the collective will of the nation. With the title secured, Preparations immediately began for a coronation ceremony of unprecedented grandeur. Napoleon understood the immense psychological and political power of symbolism, pageantry, and historical theater. He did not want a coronation that merely mirrored the ancient, decadent traditions of the old Bourbon kings, nor did he wish to appear as a mere military dictator crowned by the point of a sword. Instead, he sought to fuse the majesty of the ancient Roman Empire with the modern legitimacy of the French Revolution. He invited Pope Pius Roman VII to travel to Paris to officiate the ceremony, a brilliant diplomatic maneuver that cemented his reconciliation with the Catholic Church, while subtly demonstrating his absolute superiority over religious authority. The historic day arrived on December 2, 1804, inside the ancient, cavernous walls of the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The freezing winter morning was illuminated by thousands of flickering candles, and the cathedral was draped in rich velvet, gold bullion, and imperial purple. Dignitaries, generals, foreign ambassadors, and high-ranking officials filled the pews, wearing magnificent court dress adorned with medals, feathers, and elaborate embroidery. When Napoleon and his wife, Josephine, entered the cathedral, the atmosphere was charged with awe and nervous anticipation. The air hummed with the weight of history as the couple walked down the long, red-carpeted nave under the heavy gaze of Europe. The most dramatic moment of the ceremony broke centuries of European tradition and captured the essence of Napoleon's worldview. According to ancient custom, European monarchs received their crowns from the hands of the Pope, symbolizing that earthly power was granted by divine right through the Church. As Pope Pius Roman VII blessed the imperial regalia and prepared to place the golden laurel wreath crown upon Napoleon's head, the emperor stepped forward. With a swift, decisive gesture, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it firmly upon his own head, signaling to everyone present that his power was self-made, won by his own genius, and derived from the sovereign will of the French people. He then turned and placed a smaller crown upon the head of Josephine, formally elevating her to empress. The coronation at Notre Dame marked a profound turning point in modern European history. It signaled the birth of the First French Empire and the creation of a new imperial nobility. Napoleon quickly set about establishing an elaborate court, appointing his loyal marshals and trusted ministers to high-ranking imperial titles, and surrounding his throne with peerages, lavish ceremonies, and strict etiquette designed to rival the courts of Vienna, St. Petersburg, and London. Yet, this new aristocracy was fundamentally different from the feudal nobility of the old regime. Membership was based primarily on merit, talent, military service, and administrative capability rather than noble birth, preserving a core principle of the revolutionary ethos even within an autocratic structure. Yet, the creation of the French Empire sent shockwaves of alarm across the capitals of Europe. Traditional monarchs viewed Napoleon's imperial crown not merely as a domestic political change, but as an intolerable provocation and an existential threat to the balance of power. To the rulers of Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Prussia, an emperor of the French who commanded the most powerful army in Europe and exercised direct influence over Italy, Switzerland, and the Low Countries could never be accepted as a legitimate peer. They saw him as an upstart military adventurer whose very existence threatened the ancient dynastic order of the continent. Even as the celebrations of the coronation faded and the magnificent echoes of Notre Dame quieted, gathering storm clouds appeared on the horizon. Foreign ministries in London, Vienna, and St. Petersburg were already working furiously to forge a new military coalition, pouring vast financial subsidies into preparations for war. They calculated that France, exhausted by revolution and now burdened by the massive machinery of an empire, could be crushed if attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. Napoleon, possessing an intelligence that grasped both grand strategy and minute detail, was well aware of these hostile maneuvers. He knew that his glittering new crown could not be protected by pomp, pageantry, or diplomacy alone. Standing at the pinnacle of domestic power and surveying an empire that now stretched across the heart of Western Europe, Napoleon directed his extraordinary focus outward. He looked beyond the borders of France, anticipating the inevitable clash with the ancient monarchies that refused to tolerate his rise. The administrative machine was running with flawless precision, the treasury was stable, the economy was booming, and the Grand Armée was massing in camps along the northern coast and eastern frontiers, undergoing rigorous training that would soon make it the most lethal military force on earth. The crown of an emperor had been placed upon his head, but the true test of that empire was about to begin on the blood-soaked battlefields of Central Europe, where Napoleon would soon march to defend his throne against the might of the continent. The quiet winter fields of Central Europe were soon to become the stage for one of the most brilliant military campaigns in human history. Napoleon Bonaparte, freshly crowned as Emperor of the French, understood that the diplomatic storm gathering against him would soon break into open war. Great Britain, Austria, Russia, and Sweden had united in the Third Coalition, determined to tear down the new French Empire and restore the old balance of power. British gold funded the massive armies of the coalition, while Austrian and Russian soldiers marched toward the borders of France and its allies. Napoleon did not wait for the enemy to strike on French soil. With characteristic speed and daring, he transformed the Grand Armée from a coastal invasion force into a lightning-fast instrument of continental conquest, setting his sights on the heart of the Austrian Empire. The strategic genius of Napoleon lay in his ability to read the terrain, anticipate enemy movements, and move large bodies of troops with a speed that left his opponents bewildered. In the autumn of 1805, the French armies executed a massive, silent wheeling movement across the Rhine. While the Austrian general Mack was confidently fortifying his position at the fortress city of Ulm in Bavaria, believing the French would attack from a predictable direction, Napoleon's corps marched in separate columns to encircle him completely. The maneuver was a masterpiece of operational art. Cut off from relief, surrounded on all sides, and facing an inescapable trap, General Mack surrendered his entire army of nearly 30,000 men without a major battle. It was a stunning psychological and strategic blow to the coalition, opening the road to Vienna and signaling to Europe that the French military machine was unmatched in its efficiency. Yet, the war was far from over. The fall of Ulm brought the main Russian army under the command of General Mikhail Kutuzov into the theater of operations, joining the remnants of the Austrian forces. Napoleon occupied Vienna without significant resistance, but he knew that a decisive battle was required to shatter the coalition permanently. He deliberately lured his opponents into a trap in the rolling hills of Moravia, near the town of Austerlitz. Feigning weakness and numerical inferiority, Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, practically inviting the Austro-Russian forces to attack that sector and cut off his communications. The Allied commanders, eager for a glorious victory and convinced that the French army was on the verge of retreat, fell straight into the trap. On the cold, foggy morning of December 2, 1805, exactly 1 year after his coronation, Napoleon unleashed his masterstroke. As the thick morning fog lifted over the Pratzen Heights, the Allied armies committed the bulk of their forces to crushing the seemingly vulnerable French right wing. Napoleon watched from his command post as the enemy ranks thundered into battle, thinning their center just as he had anticipated. At the exact psychological moment, he ordered Marshal Soult's corps to charge directly up the fog-shrouded Pratzen Heights, splitting the Allied army in two. The ferocity of the French assault shattered the Allied center. With the heights secured, the French artillery poured a devastating fire down upon the disorganized enemy lines. Realizing too late that they had been outmaneuvered, the Allied left wing was completely rolled up and driven toward freezing lakes. The Battle of Austerlitz, forever remembered as the Battle of the Three Emperors, because of the presence of Napoleon, Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and Emperor Francis Roman II of Austria, resulted in a resounding and catastrophic defeat for the coalition. The victory at Austerlitz broke the spirit of the Third Coalition. Austria was forced to sue for peace, signing the humiliating Treaty of Pressburg, which stripped the Habsburg Empire of its ancient Italian and German territories and forced it to pay a massive indemnity. Tsar Alexander I withdrew his shattered armies back into the vast expanses of Russia. Napoleon was now the undisputed master of Western and Central Europe, but his ambition and the relentless hostility of his neighbors meant that peace would be short-lived. By the following year, Prussia, alarmed by the growing French hegemony over German lands, joined forces with Russia to form the Fourth Coalition, eager to test the mettle of the Emperor of the French on the battlefields of Prussia. Napoleon responded with the same terrifying speed and precision that had defined his earlier campaigns. In the autumn of 1806, the Grande Armée crossed into Prussian territory, setting the stage for a dual confrontation at Jena and Auerstedt. The Prussian army, long renowned for its rigid discipline and legendary military traditions inherited from Frederick the Great, proved utterly incapable of adapting to the fluid, fast-paced tactics of the French. At Jena, Napoleon personally directed the battle against the main Prussian force, while Marshal Davout, commanding a single isolated corps against overwhelming odds nearby at Auerstedt, achieved a legendary tactical victory by routing the primary Prussian reserve. In a single day, the pride of the Prussian military establishment was utterly shattered, and within weeks, French troops marched in triumph through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. With Prussia humbled, Napoleon turned his attention eastward toward the frozen plains of Poland, where the Russian army awaited. The winter campaign of 1806 to 1807 was fought in conditions of unimaginable hardship. Mud, snow, freezing rivers, and endless marshes turned movement into a grueling nightmare for both sides. The culmination of this brutal winter war came at the bloody and indecisive Battle of Eylau in February 1807, fought in the midst of a blinding snowstorm. Both armies suffered horrific casualties without a clear victor emerging from the carnage. Recognizing the need for a definitive resolution, Napoleon regrouped, re-equipped his forces, and planned his next move with meticulous care. That resolution came on June 14, 1807, at the Battle of Friedland. Confronting a Russian army commanded by General Bennigsen, Napoleon trapped the enemy forces against the unfordable Alais River. Unleashing a devastating artillery bombardment followed by a crushing infantry charge led by Marshal Ney, the French broke the Russian lines and drove thousands of panicked soldiers into the freezing waters of the river. The victory at Friedland was absolute. Tsar Alexander I, realizing that further resistance was futile and that his allies could offer no meaningful support, requested an armistice. The two emperors met on a specially constructed raft floating in the middle of the Niemen River at Tilsit to negotiate a peace that would redraw the map of Europe. The resulting treaties of Tilsit in July 1807 marked the absolute zenith of Napoleon's continental power. Russia agreed to join the continental system against Great Britain and recognized French hegemony in Europe, while Prussia was brutally dismembered, losing half its territory and population. From these newly conquered lands, Napoleon carved out new satellite states, creating the Kingdom of Westphalia and the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, placing members of his own family and loyal marshals on newly minted thrones. The map of Europe was no longer defined by ancient dynastic boundaries, but by the will of the French emperor. He reorganized the German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, effectively ending the thousand-year history of the Holy Roman Empire and binding Central Europe tightly to French interests. Yet, this vast imperial structure was sustained not merely by treaties and alliances, but by the constant threat of military might and the imposition of sweeping administrative reforms. Wherever Napoleon's armies triumphed, the feudal system was abolished, the Napoleonic Code was introduced, and modern systems of taxation, education, and legal governance were established. He genuinely believed that he was bringing the light of reason and progress to a backward continent, even as his rule rested firmly on conquest and subjugation. The capitals of Europe bowed to his commands, and foreign kings visited his court to pay homage, recognizing that the balance of power had been irreversibly altered. Standing at the summit of his glory, Napoleon surveyed an empire that stretched from the shores of the Atlantic to the borders of the Russian Empire. His armies were feared, his brilliance was undisputed, and his family ruled over a patchwork of allied kingdoms. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of continental dominance, the seeds of future conflict were already sown. Great Britain remained defiant and undefeated across the Channel, nursing its grievances and financing secret resistances. The enforcement of the continental system was beginning to strain the economies of Europe, and the distant resentment of subjugated populations whispered of rebellion. Napoleon had conquered the continent, but maintaining an empire built on conquest required eternal vigilance, endless war, and a perfection of fortune that no mortal ruler could sustain forever. By the summer of 1807, Napoleon stood at the absolute pinnacle of his imperial power. The treaties of Tilsit had brought the great powers of continental Europe to their knees or forced them into temporary alliance. From the Atlantic coast of France to the borders of the Russian Empire, Napoleon held sway over millions of people. Yet, maintaining this gigantic domain was an exhausting and continuous task. To govern this sprawling system, Napoleon relied on a network of satellite states, many ruled directly by his siblings and trusted marshals. His brother Joseph was placed on the throne of Naples. His brother Louis ruled Holland. His brother Jerome became king of Westphalia, and his brother-in-law Joachim Murat eventually governed Naples. Through these dynastic appointments, Napoleon hoped to secure the loyalty of conquered territories, export French administrative reforms, and build a lasting European order under the guidance of Paris. At the center of Napoleon's grand strategy to defeat his last remaining major enemy, Great Britain, was the continental system. Established by the Berlin Decree in late 1806 and expanded by the Milan Decree in 1807, this system was a massive economic blockade designed to destroy British commerce. Because the Royal Navy dominated the high seas, especially after its decisive victory over the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar in 1805, Napoleon knew he could not invade the British Isles directly. Instead, he decided to attack Britain through its pocketbook. He prohibited all European nations under his control or influence from trading with Great Britain, receiving British ships in their ports, or purchasing British manufactured goods and colonial products. Napoleon believed that by cutting off Britain from its European markets, he could cause severe economic collapse, widespread unemployment, and political upheaval in London, ultimately forcing the British government to sue for peace on French terms. However, the continental system was flawed from the beginning and created immense hardship across Europe. Britain was the world's leading industrial nation and the primary supplier of manufactured goods, tea, sugar, coffee, and textiles. When these goods disappeared from European markets, prices soared, industries collapsed, and local merchants faced ruin. Furthermore, Napoleon's continental empire lacked the shipping capacity and industrial infrastructure to replace the lost trade. To enforce the blockade, French customs agents and troops were stationed along thousands of miles of European coastline, checking ships, seizing contraband, and burning British imports in public squares. Despite these harsh measures, smuggling became a massive, highly profitable industry. Merchants, port authorities, and even Napoleon's own allies frequently turned a blind eye to illegal British trade. Even the French army itself had to secretly purchase British boots and uniforms through neutral third parties to supply its soldiers. The enforcement of the continental system drew Napoleon into fatal strategic entanglements, most notably on the Iberian Peninsula. Portugal, an ancient ally of Great Britain, openly refused to enforce the blockade, continuing to trade with British merchants. Determined to close this dangerous loophole, Napoleon reached an agreement with the Spanish government in October 1807 to invade and partition Portugal. A French army under General Junot marched through Spain and occupied Lisbon in November 1807, forcing the Portuguese royal family to flee to Brazil. However, Napoleon did not stop there. Observing the deep political corruption and internal bitter divisions within the Spanish royal court, he decided to bring the entire Iberian Peninsula under his personal control. In early 1808, under the pretext of reinforcing the occupation of Portugal, French troops poured across the Pyrenees into Spain, seizing strategic fortresses and occupying Madrid. In April 1808, Napoleon summoned both the Spanish King Charles Roman IV and his ambitious son Ferdinand Roman VII to the French border city of Bayonne. Through intense political pressure and intimidation, Napoleon forced both royal figures to renounce their claims to the Spanish throne. He then placed his elder brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain, transferring Naples to Joachim Murat. Napoleon expected the Spanish population to accept this foreign ruler and welcome the modernizing reforms, anti-clerical laws, and legal structures of the French administration. He viewed Spain as a backward nation, ruled by an outmoded aristocracy and a powerful Catholic clergy that needed French enlightenment. Napoleon made a catastrophic miscalculation. The Spanish people viewed the removal of their royal family and the arrival of French soldiers as an insulting foreign invasion and a direct assault on their Catholic faith and national honor. On May 2, 1808, a fierce popular uprising erupted in the streets of Madrid, an event immortalized as the Dos de Mayo. French troops under Murat suppressed the rebellion with harsh brutality, executing hundreds of citizens the following day. Rather than cowing the population into submission, the violence in Madrid set off a massive wave of outrage across the entire country. Provincial juntas formed to organize resistance, declaring war on the French occupiers and summoning the population to arms. In July 1808, the world witnessed a shocking event that shattered the myth of French military invincibility. At the Battle of Bayonne, an entire French army corps under General Dupont was surrounded and forced to surrender unconditionally to Spanish forces. It was the first major capitulation of a French army in the field since the rise of Napoleon. News of the defeat at Balaine sent shockwaves across the continent, proving that French armies could be beaten and inspiring anti-French sentiment throughout Europe. Soon after, King Joseph was forced to flee Madrid in humiliation, just weeks after arriving in his new capital. Seeing his control slipping, Napoleon took personal command of the Grande Armée in late 1808. Marching into Spain with over 200,000 veteran troops, he swept aside disorganized Spanish armies, recaptured Madrid, and reinstalled his brother on the throne. However, just as Napoleon prepared to pacify the country, a British expeditionary force under Sir John Moore advanced from Portugal to threaten French communications. Napoleon pursued the British toward A Coruña, but urgent diplomatic news from Central Europe forced him to leave the command of Spain to his marshals and rush back to Paris in January 1809. He would never return to the Iberian Peninsula. What followed in Spain and Portugal became known as the Peninsular War, a brutal, grueling conflict that Napoleon famously referred to as his Spanish ulcer. The war was defined by a new and terrifying style of combat, guerrilla warfare, or little war. Spanish irregular fighters, peasant bands, and local priests ambushed French supply convoys, assassinated couriers, cut lines of communication, and slaughtered isolated garrisons. The French army, designed for rapid movement and massive pitched battles against regular forces, struggled to deal with an invisible enemy that melted into the local population after every strike. In response to guerrilla tactics, French forces executed suspects and burned villages, which only deepened local hatred and brought more peasants into the resistance movement. Compounding the French struggle was the presence of a disciplined British army commanded by Sir Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington, operating from secure bases in Portugal and supported by the Royal Navy. Wellesley built a formidable defense system known as the Lines of Torres Vedras. He consistently defeated French marshals in tactical engagements, using ridge lines and disciplined infantry firepower to shatter French attacks. The Peninsular War dragged on for 6 agonizing years, swallowing hundreds of thousands of French soldiers, draining financial resources, and tying down elite troops that Napoleon desperately needed on other European fronts. Encouraged by the French entanglements in Spain, Austria decided to challenge Napoleon's hegemony once again in the spring of 1809, initiating the War of the Fifth Coalition. Emperor Francis I of Austria and his capable military commander, Archduke Charles, had spent years reforming the Austrian army, adopting French organizational methods, and raising national enthusiasm. In April 1809, Austrian forces launched a surprise invasion of Bavaria, hoping to spark a general German uprising against French rule. Napoleon reacted with characteristic speed, assembling a composite army of French troops and German allies. In a rapid campaign along the Danube, he defeated the Austrians in several engagements around Ratisbon and captured Vienna for the second time in May 1809. However, the Austrian army remained intact and retreated to the northern bank of the Danube. Attempting to cross the swollen river near Vienna, Napoleon suffered a severe tactical defeat at the Battle of Spurnesling. His troops were held off by Archduke Charles, and the French lost one of Napoleon's closest friends and finest commanders, Marshal Jean Lannes. It was Napoleon's first direct battlefield setback in over a decade. Refusing to accept defeat, Napoleon spent weeks organizing a massive concentration of force, building sturdy bridges across the Danube, and gathering reinforcements. In July 1809, he launched a second crossing and engaged the Austrian army in the colossal Battle of Wagram. Over 2 days, more than 300,000 troops fought in one of the largest artillery battles in history. Through sheer mass, heavy artillery bombardments, and a central infantry assault led by General MacDonald, Napoleon forced the Austrians to retreat. Although Wagram was a decisive French strategic victory, it was achieved at a staggering cost in casualties, revealing that Napoleon's enemies were learning his methods and becoming far more resilient. Austria was forced to sign the Treaty of Schönbrunn in October 1809, losing territory, coastline, and 3 million subjects. To secure his imperial dynasty and cement peace with the Habsburgs, Napoleon divorced Empress Josephine, who had been unable to bear him an heir, and married Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of Emperor Francis I, in 1810. In March 1811, Marie-Louise gave birth to a son, Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph, who was immediately proclaimed King of Rome. Napoleon now had a legitimate royal heir, uniting his revolutionary dynasty with the ancient bloodlines of European monarchy. By 1811, the French Empire reached its absolute territorial maximum. It encompassed 130 departments, stretching from Hamburg in northern Germany to Rome in Italy, incorporating Holland, the Hanseatic ports, the Papal States, and the Illyrian provinces directly into France. Surrounding this core empire was a ring of client kingdoms, German states in the Confederation of the Rhine, and allies such as Prussia, Austria, and Denmark. Napoleon ruled over nearly 44 million people directly, with another 40 million under his indirect authority. Yet, this vast imperial structure was far less stable than it appeared on maps. The enforcement of the continental system continued to strangle European commerce, generating widespread economic distress and resentment. In Germany, a rising sense of national consciousness began to take root among intellectuals, students, and army officers, who deeply resented French occupation, taxation, and military conscription. In Spain, the ulcer continued to bleed French strength, requiring over 300,000 veteran troops just to maintain a fragile hold on major cities, while countryside remained in hostile hands. Furthermore, relations between Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I of Russia were rapidly deteriorating. Alexander was deeply unhappy with the Treaty of Schönbrunn, the creation of the Grand Duchy of Warsaw on Russia's western border, and Napoleon's marriage into the Austrian royal family. Most importantly, the continental system was devastating the Russian economy, which depended heavily on exporting timber, hemp, and grain to Great Britain. By late 1810, Alexander quietly withdrew from full compliance with the blockade, opening Russian ports to neutral ships carrying British goods and placing heavy tariffs on French luxury imports. Napoleon viewed Alexander's economic defiance as a direct challenge to his authority and a fatal breach in the continental system. He believed that if Russia were allowed to break the blockade with impunity, the entire economic system against Britain would collapse, and his hegemony over Europe would crumble. As negotiations failed throughout 1811, both empires began preparing for a massive conflict. Beneath the glittering surface of the French Empire at its height, the seeds of structural failure and unsustainable ambition were rapidly maturing, setting the stage for a tragic collision that would decide the fate of Europe. By the winter of 1811, the uneasy peace that had existed between the French Empire and the Russian Empire was completely broken. Tsar Alexander I had chosen to defy the continental system, opening Russian ports to neutral merchant vessels and allowing British goods to re-enter his country. For Napoleon, This economic defiance was a direct challenge to his absolute authority over Europe. He believed that if Russia escaped the restrictions of the blockade without facing severe consequences, other nations would follow its example, and his entire commercial weapon against Great Britain would collapse. Rather than seeking a diplomatic solution, Napoleon decided that the only way to secure his continental order and force the Tsar back into compliance was through overwhelming military force. He began to organize the largest military expedition Europe had ever witnessed. Throughout the spring of 1812, Napoleon gathered troops from every corner of his vast empire and its satellite states. French veterans, German conscripts, Italians, Poles, Dutch, Swiss, Spaniards, and Austrians marched toward the Polish border, forming a multinational host known as the Grand Armée. This colossal force eventually numbered over 600,000 men, supported by thousands of supply wagons, heavy artillery pieces, and hundreds of thousands of horses. It was an astonishing display of mobilization and imperial power. Yet, this massive size was also its greatest weakness. An army of 600,000 men required an unprecedented logistical effort to feed, clothe, and supply. The administrative systems of the era were simply not equipped to manage such a monstrous logistical challenge over the vast and underdeveloped distances of Eastern Europe. In June 1812, without a formal declaration of war, the Grand Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon expected that the Russian army would be forced to offer battle close to the border, allowing his superior tactical genius to crush them in a single decisive engagement, just as he had done at Austerlitz or Friedland. However, the Russian military commanders, under the leadership of General Barclay de Tolly and later Mikhail Kutuzov, adopted a very different strategy. Realizing they could not match the numbers and brilliance of Napoleon in a traditional pitched battle, the Russian forces chose to retreat deeper into their own territory. As they fell back, they practiced a deliberate scorched earth policy, destroying crops, burning villages, driving away livestock, and leaving nothing behind that could be used by the invading French army. This strategy of strategic withdrawal and destruction baffled and frustrated Napoleon. The anticipated decisive battle remained out of reach, while the endless march through the dusty, baking plains of western Russia began to take a severe toll on the Grand Armée. Even before meeting the enemy in serious combat, the French army suffered staggering losses. The blazing summer heat, lack of clean drinking water, poor quality rations, and exhaustion caused thousands of soldiers to fall ill with dysentery and typhus. Furthermore, the supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of poor roads, constantly harassed by Russian Cossacks. Thousands of horses died from exhaustion and lack of forage, rendering cavalry units ineffective and leaving supply wagons stranded along the muddy tracks. Despite these mounting difficulties, Napoleon pushed relentlessly forward, desperate to bring the Russian army to battle and force a political surrender. Finally, in September 1812, the Russian army made a stand at the village of Borodino, roughly 70 miles west of Moscow. Kutuzov knew he had to offer battle to satisfy the demands of the Tsar and the Russian public, who were clamoring to defend the holy city of Moscow. The resulting Battle of Borodino was one of the largest and bloodiest single-day engagements of the Napoleonic Wars. From dawn until dusk, over 250,000 men clashed in a brutal struggle of attrition. The battlefield was dominated by massive artillery bombardments and desperate infantry assaults against fortified Russian earthworks known as the Great Redoubt and the Bagration Fletches. Both sides fought with extraordinary stubbornness and courage. Napoleon, suffering from a severe cold and uncharacteristically hesitant, refused to commit his elite Imperial Guard reserves to deliver a final, decisive breakthrough, fearing to lose his last dependable force so far from home. By nightfall, the firing ceased, leaving the blood-soaked field littered with tens of thousands of dead and wounded men. Although the Russian army withdrew under cover of darkness, leaving the field in French hands, they remained intact and unconquered. The Grande Armée had suffered catastrophic casualties, losing nearly 30,000 men, including many irreplaceable veteran officers. Borodino was a Pyrrhic victory that failed to destroy the Russian army. A week after the battle, the Grande Armée approached the ancient and sprawling city of Moscow. Napoleon expected that the surrender of this historic capital would compel Tsar Alexander to sue for peace. However, as the French vanguard entered the city, they found it eerily deserted. The vast majority of Moscow's population, along with its governor, Count Fyodor Rostopchin, had evacuated, leaving behind an empty urban labyrinth. Soon after the French occupation began, massive fires broke out simultaneously in different parts of the city. Fueled by high winds and wooden structures, the flames raged out of control for days, turning a significant portion of Moscow into a smoking ruin. Whether the fires were set by Russian patriots, criminals released from prisons, or accidental causes remains debated by historians, but the result was devastating. Napoleon and his staff established their headquarters inside the safety of the Kremlin, looking out over a sea of ashes. Weeks passed in anxious waiting as Napoleon lingered in Moscow, foolishly believing that the Tsar would send envoys to negotiate a peace treaty. Alexander, however, remained utterly resolute, refusing to communicate or compromise. As October arrived, the weather began to turn chilly, reminding the French emperor of the approaching Russian winter. Realizing that staying in a burned city without adequate supplies or shelter was suicidal, Napoleon finally ordered the retreat from Moscow in mid-October 1812, hoping to withdraw his army toward warmer quarters in Smolensk. The retreat from Moscow quickly degenerated into one of the greatest military catastrophes in human history. The autumn rains turned the dirt roads into impassable oceans of thick mud, slowing the march to a crawl and forcing the abandonment of many heavy cannons and supply carts. Soon after, the infamous Russian winter descended with brutal severity, bringing freezing temperatures, howling winds, and towering snowdrifts. The soldiers of the Grande Armée, dressed in summer uniforms and lacking winter clothing, suffered unspeakable hardships. Thousands froze to death overnight, while others collapsed from starvation, disease, and sheer exhaustion along the snowy roadsides. To make matters worse, the revived Russian army under Kutuzov, alongside relentless bands of Cossacks and peasant partisans, hovered constantly around the retreating columns. They attacked stragglers, cut off rear guards, and harassed the starving army at every river crossing and defile. The crossing of the Berezina River in November 1812 brought near total annihilation, as freezing waters, Russian artillery fire, and panic turned the escape into a horrific scramble of survival. By the time the ragged survivors of the once mighty Grande Armée staggered back across the Niemen River in December 1812, only a tiny fraction of the original force remained fit for duty. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility was shattered forever, and the door was wide open for a grand European coalition to rise up and strike down the wounded emperor. The horrific disaster in Russia left the French Empire severely wounded and vulnerable. Out of the 600,000 men who had marched across the Niemen River in the summer of 1812, only a shattered, exhausted remnant managed to crawl back. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Napoleon for nearly 2 decades was completely gone. Across Europe, The psychological shock of the Russian catastrophe shifted the balance of power. Rulers, diplomats, and military leaders who had long bowed to French dominance suddenly sensed that the great conqueror was mortal, and that his colossal empire could finally be defeated. For Napoleon, the crisis demanded an immediate and superhuman effort. He knew that if he projected weakness, his allies would desert him and his enemies would close in for the kill. Without wasting a single moment, Napoleon abandoned the remnants of his freezing army in Poland in December 1812 and raced across Europe in a heavily disguised sleigh, arriving in Paris before the full scale of the disaster was publicly understood. He found a capital gripped by shock, mourning, and nervous whispers. Whispers of a failed coup attempt while he was away in Russia reminded him that his political security at home was fragile. Yet, Napoleon wasted no time indulging in self-pity or despair. With his characteristic drive and energy, he immediately set to work rebuilding his military strength from the ground up. He faced a monumental task. The old veteran corps of the Grand Armée was largely buried in the snows of Russia, and thousands of experienced officers and horses were gone forever. Despite these staggering losses, Napoleon's iron will and administrative genius performed an astonishing feat of mobilization. By early 1813, he had issued urgent decrees calling up new classes of conscripts, drawing teenagers and older reservists into the ranks. He stripped naval crews of their guns, requisitioned horses from across the empire, and worked day and night in his Paris study to organize a brand new army. However, this hastily assembled force was very different from the battle-hardened veterans of Austerlitz and Jena. It lacked proper training, experienced cavalry, and seasoned junior officers. Meanwhile, the political landscape of Europe was transforming at a rapid pace. Prussia, which had been forced to serve as a reluctant French ally during the invasion of Russia, seized the historic moment to break away. In early 1813, Prussian King Frederick William Roman III signed a secret alliance with Tsar Alexander I, calling upon the German people to rise up in a patriotic war of liberation against French occupation. As the spring of 1813 arrived, Napoleon marched his new, inexperienced army into central Germany to meet the advancing Russian and Prussian forces. He was determined to prove that his military touch had not faded. The campaign began with a series of tactical successes for the French emperor. At the battles of Lutzen and Bautzen in May 1813, Napoleon skillfully maneuvered his raw recruits to outwit the Allied armies, forcing them to retreat. However, unlike his previous campaigns, these victories lacked the decisive, shattering impact he desperately needed. His lack of a strong cavalry prevented him from pursuing and completely destroying the retreating enemy forces. Recognizing his weakness in cavalry and hoping to gain time to strengthen his armies, Napoleon agreed to a temporary armistice in the summer of 1813, a decision that many historians consider one of the gravest strategic mistakes of his career. During the summer truce, Austria, led by the astute diplomat Clemens von Metternich, abandoned its cautious neutrality and joined the growing anti-French coalition. Austria proposed peace terms that would have allowed Napoleon to remain emperor of the French, but stripped him of his control over Germany, Italy, and Poland. Driven by his unyielding pride and his absolute belief that compromise was a sign of weakness, Napoleon rejected the offer, shouting that he would never surrender his imperial borders. With Austria's entry into the coalition, the ring of enemies tightened further. Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden united in a massive coalition, determined to crush the Napoleonic system once and for all. Hostilities resumed in August 1813, and the war quickly turned against the French. Napoleon scored a brilliant tactical victory at the Battle of Dresden, defeating a larger coalition army through sheer force of will and artillery coordination. Yet, his marshals, commanding separate armies in the surrounding regions, suffered a string of demoralizing defeats. The relentless coalition strategy, designed by Allied generals to avoid fighting Napoleon directly while attacking his subordinate commanders, slowly ground down French military strength across Germany. The net was closing in around the emperor, and the theater of war was inexorably shifting toward a final, titanic showdown. That showdown arrived in October 1813 at the Battle of Leipzig, known historically as the Battle of the Nations. Fought over 4 days outside the city of Leipzig in Saxony, it was the largest battle of the Napoleonic Wars, involving over 500,000 soldiers from both sides. Napoleon positioned his army defensively, facing an overwhelming coalition force that vastly outnumbered him on every flank. The fighting was ferocious, characterized by massive artillery barrages, desperate cavalry charges, and brutal infantry combat in burning villages. For 2 days, the French held their ground with stubborn bravery, but the sheer weight of numbers began to tell against them. As the battle reached its climax, Napoleon's German allies, the troops of the Confederation of the Rhine, suddenly defected on the battlefield, turning their weapons against the French. Despite this staggering betrayal, Napoleon fought on with desperate fury. By the 4th day, however, the position became completely untenable. Outnumbered, outgunned, and running low on ammunition, Napoleon ordered a general retreat across the Elster River. The withdrawal turned into a catastrophe when a retreating French engineer prematurely blew up the only bridge across the river, while thousands of French soldiers were still crossing. Hundreds of men, including senior generals, drowned or were captured by the pursuing Allies. The Battle of Leipzig was a definitive defeat that shattered Napoleon's hold on Germany. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved instantly, and the remaining French garrisons scattered across Central Europe were cut off and forced to surrender. As the winter of 1813 set in, Napoleon retreated across the Rhine River and returned to French soil, bringing the war directly to the borders of his homeland for the first time since the Revolution. The French population, exhausted by decades of continuous warfare, heavy taxation, and endless conscription of their sons, greeted his return with somber silence rather than patriotic fervor. Yet, in the face of insurmountable odds, Napoleon displayed a brilliant final flash of his tactical genius during the campaign of 1814. With a tiny, exhausted army of fewer than 70,000 men, he fought a masterclass in mobile warfare across the freezing plains of northeastern France, repeatedly outmaneuvering and defeating separate coalition armies in rapid succession during the famous 6 Days campaign. Napoleon's lightning maneuvers won the admiration of even his enemies, but his numerical inferiority was simply too great to overcome. While he dashed from one battlefield to another, massive coalition armies continued to push relentlessly toward Paris. The Allies realized that chasing Napoleon across the countryside was a losing game. Instead, they bypassed him and marched directly on the French capital. The defense of Paris was left in the hands of Marshal Marmont and a small, disorganized garrison of National Guardsmen and cadets. Following a brief and desperate defense of the city's outer perimeter, the local authorities realized that further resistance was hopeless and signed an armistice to save Paris from destruction and pillage. On March 31, 1814, foreign troops marched triumphantly through the gates of Paris for the first time in centuries. Tsar Alexander I and the Allied monarchs entered the city not as brutal conquerors, but as liberators, welcomed by royalist sympathizers who had long waited in the shadows. The French Senate, sensing which way the political winds were blowing, quickly turned against Napoleon, officially voting to depose the emperor and restore the Bourbon monarchy in the person of Louis Roman XVIII. Isolated, abandoned by his closest marshals who refused to launch a suicidal counterattack to retake Paris, and urged by his generals to step down, Napoleon finally recognized that his reign had come to an end. At the palace of Fontainebleau in April 1814, Napoleon signed his unconditional abdication. In a deeply emotional scene, he bade farewell to the remaining officers of his old guard, kissing their flags and thanking them for their unwavering loyalty through 2 decades of glorious triumphs and unimaginable tragedies. The coalition victors granted him sovereignty over the small Mediterranean island of Elba, along with a generous pension and the title of Emperor of Elba, hoping that a quiet island exile would keep him safely out of European politics. As Napoleon sailed away to his Mediterranean retreat, Europe breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing that the stormy era of the French Revolution and Napoleonic expansion was finally closed forever. The victorious powers gathered in Vienna to redraw the map of Europe and restore the old dynastic order. Yet, the peace was built on shaky foundations. The restored Bourbon monarchy quickly proved out of touch with a France that had fundamentally changed over the past 25 years, and discontent began to simmer among the disgruntled populace and idle veterans. Napoleon watched these developments closely from his island home, waiting for the right moment to make his dramatic return to the world stage. The quiet island of Elba was never going to be enough to hold a man like Napoleon Bonaparte. While the victorious European powers gathered in Vienna to redraw the map of a continent, trying to push the clock back to the days before the French Revolution, the former emperor watched and waited. He kept informed through secret letters, smuggled newspapers, and visitors who slipped onto the island. Napoleon knew that the restored Bourbon monarchy, led by King Louis Roman XVIII, was making bitter enemies across France. The old nobility was returning with demands for their ancient privileges. Veterans of the Grande Armée were treated with suspicion and denied their pensions, and the common people worried that the revolutionary gains, such as land ownership and legal equality, would be quietly stripped away. The political soil of France was once again fertile, and the scent of revolution and discontent drifted across the Mediterranean to Elba. In early 1815, Napoleon decided to take a gamble that stunned the world. Seizing a moment when British guards were temporarily absent and friendly local support secured his path, he slipped away from Elba under the cover of night. On March 1, 1815, Napoleon landed on the southern coast of France at Galf-Juan with a tiny force of just over 1,000 loyal soldiers. He had no grand army, no massive artillery train, and no certainty of success. He was marching into what his enemies hoped was a trap, betting everything on the personal magnetism that had won him the devotion of France 2 decades earlier. As he marched northward toward Paris along a rugged mountain route, now known as the Route Napoleon, the royal government sent regular army regiments to arrest the dangerous intruder and put an end to his madness once and for all. The defining moment of this daring return occurred near the town of Laffrey. A battalion of royal troops, commanded to block his advance, lined up across the narrow mountain pass with muskets loaded and ready to fire. There was a tense, breathless silence as Napoleon walked out alone ahead of his small band of followers, wearing his iconic gray overcoat and cocked hat. He stopped within easy range of the royalist muskets, opened his coat wide, and shouted out to the soldiers facing him, calling out that if there was any man among them who wanted to kill his emperor, here he was. For a moment, the tension was unbearable, with fingers twitching on triggers. Then the emotional dam broke. Someone shouted out, "Vive l'Empereur!" And in an instant the entire royal battalion threw down their weapons, wept openly, and rushed forward to embrace their former leader. The soldiers sent to capture him instead swelled his ranks, and the march to Paris turned into a triumphant royal procession. As Napoleon drew closer to the capital, King Louis Roman XVIII panicked and fled across the border into exile, leaving his court behind in disarray. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon arrived at the Tuileries Palace in Paris, carried into the building by an ecstatic crowd of soldiers and citizens who hoisted him onto their shoulders. Thus began the period known in history as the 100 Days. Napoleon quickly discovered, however, that reclaiming France was much easier than keeping the rest of Europe at bay. He tried to present a moderate, liberal face to the world, promising a constitutional government and peace with his neighbors. But the major European powers meeting in Vienna refused to negotiate. To them, Napoleon was not a legitimate sovereign, but an outlaw and a disturber of the peace. Great Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia immediately declared him an enemy of humanity and mobilized an immense coalition, pledging hundreds of thousands of soldiers to crush him once and for all before he could rebuild his military strength. Realizing that he had no choice, Napoleon acted with his old lightning speed. He knew that the coalition armies were gathering slowly in the north, with British and Allied forces under the Duke of Wellington stationed in modern-day Belgium, alongside a Prussian army commanded by Field Marshal Blücher. If he waited for them to combine their massive forces and invade France together, he would be hopelessly outnumbered. His only strategic hope was to strike first, drive a wedge between the British and Prussian armies, and defeat them separately in a brilliant, rapid campaign. In June 1815, Napoleon quietly crossed the border into Belgium, catching the Allied commanders by surprise and launching the final military campaign of his legendary career. The opening phases of the campaign showed that Napoleon had lost none of his tactical sharpness. At the Battle of Ligny on June 16, he decisively defeated Blücher's Prussian army, forcing them to retreat in disarray. He made the critical assumption that the Prussians were fleeing eastward and were entirely out of the fight, so he detached a subordinate force under Marshal Grouchy to track and harass them. Napoleon then turned his attention northward to deal with the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army, which had taken up a strong defensive position on a ridge near a small village called Waterloo. Napoleon fully expected to sweep Wellington aside before the Prussians could recover and return to the field. But fate, weather, and operational missteps were about to conspire against him in the most dramatic fashion possible. On the night of June 17, a violent, torrential thunderstorm broke over the Belgian countryside, turning the rich farmland into a thick, clinging sea of mud. The downpour delayed the opening of the Battle of Waterloo on the morning of June 18, giving the ground precious hours to dry out enough for artillery wheels to move, but also giving Blücher's recovering Prussian army vital time to march to Wellington's rescue. The battle began with a thunderous exchange of artillery fire, followed by massive French infantry assaults against the British center and strongholds like the fortified farmhouse of Hougoumont. Wellington's troops, highly disciplined and sheltered behind the reverse slope of the ridge, absorbed the blows with grim stubbornness. Napoleon hurled wave after wave of infantry and spectacular cavalry charges across the muddy valley, trying to break the British lines before the relentless arrival of the Prussian army on his right flank. By the late afternoon, the battle had reached a desperate, terrifying climax. Smoke hung thick over the blood-soaked fields, blotting out the summer sun. The horizon to the east began to darken with the unmistakable arrival of Prussian columns, commanded by Blucher, which crashed into Napoleon's right flank and forced the emperor to divide his diminishing reserves to hold them off. Realizing that time had run out and that total defeat stared him in the face, Napoleon made one final, legendary gamble. He committed his last untouched reserve, the fearsome and undefeated veterans of the Imperial Guard. These elite soldiers, who had never lost a battle, marched up the ridge in the face of murderous musket and artillery fire. For a few agonizing moments, it seemed as though their sheer willpower might break the Anglo-Allied line. But Wellington's men held firm, delivered devastating point-blank volleys, and launched a massive counterattack that sent the Imperial Guard staggering backward in confusion. The cry went up through the French ranks that the Guard was retreating, and panic spread like wildfire across the battlefield. The French army dissolved into a chaotic, fleeing mob, pursued relentlessly by fresh Prussian cavalrymen who showed no mercy. Napoleon watched in stunned silence as his great empire vanished into the smoke of Waterloo. Returning to Paris, he found that political support had evaporated overnight. Recognizing that further resistance would only bring foreign occupation and civil destruction, Napoleon signed his second abdication on June 22, 1815, bringing a definitive end to his rule. Attempting to flee to the United States, Napoleon reached the French coast, but found his escape blocked by a strict British naval blockade. With no other options left, he made the fateful decision to surrender to the British captain of the HMS Bellerophon, throwing himself upon the mercy of his most stubborn and unyielding enemy. The British government had no intention of letting him remain in Europe or even live as a private citizen in England. They chose a remote, windswept volcanic island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean as his final prison, St. Helena. Thousands of miles away from civilization, surrounded by crashing waves and towering cliffs, Napoleon spent his final years dictating his memoirs, polishing his historical legacy, and brooding over the glorious heights he had once conquered. Napoleon Bonaparte passed away on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, most likely from stomach cancer, bringing an end to one of the most extraordinary lives in human history. From an impoverished noble boy on a rugged Mediterranean island to an artillery officer during a chaotic revolution, and finally to an emperor who reshaped the laws, borders, and destiny of Europe, his journey was unlike any other. The wars he fought left millions dead and empires scarred, but the legal codes, administrative systems, and modern institutions he built survived long after his banners were lowered. Napoleon left behind a complex, fascinating legacy, part brilliant visionary who carried the torch of modernization, and part ruthless conqueror whose towering ambition ultimately brought about his own destruction, ensuring that